Hi everyone. Good to see you on my channel today. Today I will tell you a wonderful story. It is full of love and kindness. I hope you enjoy it and I wish you an enjoyable viewing experience. Thank you.
The working day in the company was over. Alex Smith, having switched off the computer, went down to the underground guarded garage of his own firm. There he was waiting for a new premium class car, which the young businessman had bought only a month ago. Great car, Alex thought to himself as he drove out of the garage into the street. On such a car, one is not ashamed to come to a meeting with foreign partners. This car still inspires respect. Alex recently turned 30, and he celebrated his anniversary with an incredible scale. He rented the most expensive restaurant in the city for the evening and invited a lot of guests. The fun lasted until the morning, so that this day he himself and his mates will remember for a long time. Smith drove quickly to the motorway. There was almost no traffic at that time. The businessman easily reached his luxurious cottage in about 15 to 20 minutes. On the threshold of the house, he was already met by Trinity, his fiancée. "Are you punctual as always, my love?" The girl kissed the groom on the cheek. "And I've just baked your favorite spinach pies. Come in, wash your hands, and come to the table." Alex lightly embraced Trinity and smiled politely. They were to be married in just a month, so the bride spent all her free time supervising the organization of all wedding processes, from the choice of location for the photo shoot to the color of napkins and balloons. The wedding promised to be very lush and loud. The Smith family even gave a note about this event in the press, say, "Come all who know the bride or groom, or just want to express their respect and wish the couple all the best in their new life together." Alex's fate could be called perfect, if not for one, but in fact, he did not really want to go to such a responsible step. He was pushed by his own parents, who saw Trinity as a perfect match for their son. "Alex, sweetheart, you don't worry," his mother, Mrs. Vanessa, told him. "Trinity is a very good girl. Thanks to her parents, our position in the market will only get even stronger. You know, the Brown family is one of the most influential in printing and design. They will give us access to their own facilities, and that will be very good for our company." "Yes, son, listen to what your mother says," Mr. Carl agreed with her with a laugh. "Father, believe me, it is not good for men to think in such a matter. A marriage of convenience is the sure way to a happy married life. Mrs. Vanessa and I know that." Mr. Carl gave him a meaning smile and a wink, but his wife only grinned briefly. She knew perfectly well that if she did not marry the stroppy son now, and with the benefit of the family business, it would only get worse. And Alex, who was always by nature a proud and willful boy, nevertheless accepted his parents' choice. He understood, at his age, many of the world-famous businessmen had already got families and children. He had to think first of all about the continuation of the family, that the presence of a wife and heirs will help him to strengthen his own position in the business environment. And in this respect, Trinity turned out to be quite an acceptable option. She was beautiful, sweet, educated. In addition, his parents knew the Browns for a long time, and Trinity, in truth, was the first candidate for the role of his future wife. The girl herself was not against such a marriage at all. She liked Alex for a long time. She really wanted to marry him. Alex hoped that in time their sympathy would probably grow into something more, and if they would not become passionate lovers, they would at least respect each other. That would be enough for the young businessman. The Smith family owned a large furniture and door hardware business. The business was profitable. The spouses had been engaged in it for many years. But now the parents felt it was time to put the management of the company in the hands of their only son, so that he could bring a fresh creative eye and the latest trends in the field to their empire. Alex, who up to this point had mostly had only a superficial acquaintance with his family's business, found himself somewhat shocked at the scale of the business he was now to manage. Previously, most of his life had been spent partying with friends and courting beautiful girls. But now everything has changed, and the young man had to grow up sharply, as his parents, already being at a rather respectable age, dreamed of finally having a holiday themselves, passing their child into the safe hands of their son. And so the young businessman was preparing for the wedding, at the same time continuing to manage the business, when a strange event happened in his life. Once a fortnight before the celebration, Alex received a very unusual letter by mail. The thing was, the letter turned out to be stamped with the stamp of a regional prison. What the hell is that? He wondered to himself and locked himself in the bathroom so he could print it out and read it quietly away from prying eyes. In the letter, a certain Marion was informing Alex that he had 3 wonderful sons. 3. Not only that, but Marion had given birth to them in the colony. So now, unless he intended to participate in any way in their lives and upbringing, she was going to sue him for child support. To say that Alex was shocked when he read the letter is to say nothing. "What the hell is this?" he muttered under his breath. "What children? What is this woman even writing about?" He ran his hand over his face, as if he wanted to wipe away any trace of worry and anxiety. "Okay, the most important thing now is that Trinity doesn't find out about this stupidity," Alex said out loud to himself. "It's probably some kind of evil prank. A joke to ruin the mood of me and my fiancée before the wedding." Deciding so, the young man tore the letter into 4 pieces and, stuffing it deeper into his pocket, walked out of the bathroom. "Honey, are you all right?" Trinity inquired in a concerned tone. "I saw you got some mail. I hope it's nothing bad." Alex made a sort of smile on his face, but it didn't work very well. Trinity immediately realized something was wrong with her fiancé. No, what is it, my love?" the man quickly muttered. "It's all right, just a routine business mailing. Nothing serious." "And don't they send that sort of thing by email?" the bride asked doubtfully. Alex tried to guffaw, saying that his partners were the ones who stayed true to the old traditions and liked to send paper letters. Only Trinity didn't really believe it. "What? Does he take me for a fool or what?" The girl thought to herself. "I didn't spend 5 years in Canada studying psychology to be fooled like this." "I'm actually very hungry," the groom hastened to change the subject. "And I thought you said you had something extremely delicious tonight. Can I taste it?" And Alex smiled at her again, but it came out extremely fake. "Sure, honey," she pretended to believe his excuses. "The roast is waiting for you in the kitchen." All evening, Trinity behaved like a model wife. But as soon as they went to bed, she jumped into the kitchen on the pretext of thirst and immediately rushed to the rubbish bin, where, as she noticed, Alex had thrown the remains of the letter, pulling out all 4 halves. The girl folded them and read with horror about some Marion and her children. The businessman's fiancée was far from stupid, and that's why she realized at once that it smelled of treason. Jealousy gripped Trinity's heart, and she hardly waited until morning to tell her fiancé everything that had accumulated in her soul over the past night. "Why don't you tell me about your mistress Marion?" she asked angrily, looking at Alex. He was just pouring coffee into his cup when he saw his disgruntled fiancée in the kitchen doorway. Trinity folded her arms across her chest and looked determined to get the truth out of her fiancé. "What mistress?" He didn't understand at first. "You must be confused about something, sweetheart." Then Alex remembered the letter and immediately turned pale. Here, his fiancée nodded at him. "Not only did you decide to have some woman on the side, but she also managed to have a baby in prison. Alex, do you realize what a shame this is for me?" Trinity's eyes were burning wildly. But Alex was just confused, not knowing what to say to the accusation. He had absolutely no idea who this Marion was, nor did he know why she had written to this particular address. Surely it must be some mistake, the rich man tried to reassure her. There's little to know what those poor sissies have in mind. Maybe she made it all up in the first place, and there are no children there at all. You'd better be right, the bride wagged her finger at him, because if I find out you're lying to me, and even on the eve of the wedding, I'm going to be very, very disappointed in you, Alex. Trinity left the kitchen, throwing her long red hair over her shoulder irritably, emphasizing her displeasure with the intonation of her fiance's name. No matter how rich her fiance was, she hadn't found herself on the streets either, and she wouldn't tolerate any children in their home. Alex only exhaled a sigh of relief then, feeling the storm had passed. The man quietly finished his coffee and got ready for work. He didn't know who had sent him that damned letter, and to be honest, he didn't want to find out. The businessman hoped that the situation would resolve itself like a bad dream. However, he was very much mistaken. About a week after the incident, someone rang the bell at the gate of Alex and his fiance's house. Alex was going to go to the atelier for a fitting that day to check how his wedding suit would fit him. When he opened the gate, to his amazement, he saw a young, attractive woman in fancy clothes on the threshold. She was holding on to the handle of a spacious pram containing 3 adorable babies. The stunned businessman could only ask in a weak voice, "Who are you? What do you want?" The woman looked at him sullenly, then quietly interjected, "Are you the one asking me who I am? Do you even have a conscience, William?" Alex shook his head negatively. "You must be mistaken. I'm not William. My name is Alex Smith, and I'm sorry I don't know you at all." The eyebrows on the woman's face rose upwards in surprise. "Ah, that's it. He doesn't know. So how to fill my head with romantic nonsense so everything is fine, but how to bear responsibility, to bring up children so he doesn't know me. You've got yourself a good job, I see." "Calm down, please," Alex asked her. "My fiancée is at home. She can hear you." "That's fine. Let her hear you." The guest shouted back as loudly as possible. "What did you think? Change your name so I won't find you. The whole capital is buzzing about your wedding with that woman. I'm not stupid either. I saw an article in the newspaper about your fiancée. You found yourself a rich girl, William, beautiful as a picture." "What's the matter?" Trinity came up to them at that moment. She had already heard the loud cries in the courtyard and had therefore hurried to her fiancé. The visitor looked at the bride with undisguised hatred. "And good luck to you too, beautiful," she said in a mocking tone, and bowed jokingly to Trinity. "But here, you see, we are having a small talk with your fiancé. I have borne him children, these very ones." Marion nodded at the triplets, "and he won't recognize me. He's hiding from me. Even changed his name. He's so afraid." Trinity stared at Alex in shock, but he felt the same way. He was definitely seeing the woman standing in front of him for the first time in his life. "Is it true what she says?" his fiancée asked him with tears in her eyes. No, I swear to you." The businessman shook his head. "I don't know her at all, and I don't understand what's going on here. It's some kind of circus." It was here that the young man finally realized who was in front of him. "Wait, so you're Marion? You're the one who wrote the other day?" The woman grinned briefly and wickedly. "Wow, you deign to remember my name. Yes, I am Marion, and these are your children, you wretched scoundrel. I did 8 months in prison, pregnant by you, by the way. That's when our children were born. I was released on parole. Thank God I didn't have a very heavy sentence. So they had mercy on a single mother with many children." "My God, what a horror," was all Trinity could exclaim. Spurred on by anger and resentment, she asked her fiancé, "And you're still going to claim you knew nothing about her? How could you?" It seemed to Alex that his head was about to explode from this absurdity. There were groundless accusations coming at him from both sides. It was clear that this Marion thought he was the father of her children. But that certainly could never be. "Look here, why don't we go into the house? I'll get the housekeeper to make you some hot tea, and I'm sure we can sort it all out. Just let's stop shouting in the middle of the street." Be that as it may, Alex's upbringing prevented him from chasing this poor woman off the doorstep. He was determined to sort things out, and he felt sorry for her children, who were certainly not to blame. Marion hesitated, but then agreed and went into the house. The triplets began to worry. The mother realized they were hungry. The housekeeper took the woman to a separate room where she could feed the children in peace, while she brewed aromatic herbal tea for the guests. "One thing I don't understand, Alex. When did you have time to go left?" Trinity hissed angrily to the businessman before anyone could hear. "Seems like you've been at work all day, tired, and you've only spent the night with me. I can't believe you could flatter that redneck." Alex looked at her with a grim look. "I'm telling you for the 100th time, honey, I didn't cheat on you. This is a mistake, but I'm going to try to find out why that woman thinks that." The bride looked at him skeptically. "Do you think I'm really going to believe your words after all this?" Alex had no intention of continuing this argument, especially since Marion had already come out to join them in the kitchen. As she sat at the table, the businessman tried to ask her as correctly as possible. "Marion, explain why you are sure that I am the father of your children." The mother of many children looked at him as if she were explaining the simplest truths to an unintelligent child. "Who else would it be? Or don't you remember how you first charmed me and had an affair with me and then brazenly set me up?" Alex looked at his guest with genuine sympathy. Whatever had happened to this woman, she had clearly been through something terrible. "I mean, we worked at that firm together. Remember, I was an accountant. And you made me sign that unfortunate document that put me on the outside. I went to jail for it. And just before the trial, I found out I was expecting your baby. The doctors told me later that I was having triplets," Marion said, barely holding back her tears. She was very hurt that the man she loved so sincerely had betrayed her. And now she didn't even want to admit that he was wrong. Alex looked at Marion carefully and then asked, "Can you tell me the exact name of the company where you worked and the time period you held the position of accountant there?" She nodded and gave all the information she was interested in. Alex nodded then and called the housekeeper over to him. "Mrs. Megan will show you to a room where you can stay with the children. Please try to calm down and rest. In the meantime, I will try to find out what happened to you and your real fiancé." Marion only looked at him in amazement. She hadn't expected Alex to be so involved with her. For the first time, the woman began to wonder if it was really her William in front of her. "Thank you," she said suddenly. "Whoever you are, thank you for not leaving me and my children in distress." As the housekeeper took Marion to the first floor, a furious Trinity burst into the kitchen. "What, are you really determined to keep that girl in our house? You're out of your mind." Alex only raised his hand warningly in response. "Hold the heat, honey. I need to find out why it was Marion who mistook me for the father of her children. The story she told is very much true. I just checked on the internet, and the company she was talking about does exist. It's in a neighboring town in the region. I'll go there tomorrow and find out." Trinity wanted to scandalize her fiancé, but thought better of it. There's no telling what's going on. What if there really is some kind of misunderstanding? Then it would appear that she ruined her and Alex's happiness with her own hands. She wanted too much to get married, and had put too much effort into making the upcoming ceremony perfect. And for that matter, she could put up with that boorish Marion and her children for a couple of days. The next morning, the businessman hit the road, arriving in a neighboring town and finding the office, presumably the one he worked in. Alex, a little worried, walked through the door. "Oh, Mr. William," exclaimed the guard cheerfully at the sight of him. "It's been a long time since you visited us. We've lost track of you. How are you? How is your health?" "What about my health?" Alex didn't understand. "But how come?" The security guard lowered his eyes in embarrassment. "You went straight to sick leave after that incident. Only you didn't show up at our place again, so we thought you were seriously ill." The young businessman realized that if he wanted to find out the truth, he would have to play along with the local staff. "Thanks, I'm fine now," he replied evasively. "But can you remind me what floor our office is on? I'm not very good at orientating myself in space after my illness." The guard looked at him in surprise for a moment, but then he said, "It's still the same. We are based on the 6th floor. Nothing has changed in the meantime." Alex thanked him and then proceeded to the indicated floor. There he really found a large open-type office. The mass of employees sat side by side, separated only by plastic partitions, which created a very faint illusion of a separate space. Several people from the general hive immediately caught sight of him and began to wave vigorously at Alex. "Mr. William, you're finally back. How we've missed you," a pretty blonde woman said, embarrassed, as she approached the businessman. "William, darling, isn't it a miracle? Where have you been all this time? Where have you disappeared to?" Some overweight man in glasses asked him, while shaking the businessman desperately by the arm. "Yes, I have. As a matter of fact, look, why do you all call me William?" The people around him immediately fell silent and began to look amongst themselves in surprise. Finally, the blonde replied, "Because you, Mr. William Willis, are our beloved head of sales. Don't you remember anything?" Alex shook his head in surprise. Then the man in glasses continued. "You disappeared from the office a few months ago, just before our head accountant, Marion Johnson's, went to jail. She'd forged some kind of document and stole a few million from the company. And after that, you got sick and disappeared." Alex understood absolutely nothing. How could this be possible if he had been leading his normal life all this time? The only explanation could be that he had a twin brother or a very similar twin. But the latter was most unlikely. Did he really have a twin he knew nothing about? Thanking the staff and getting rid of their persistent curiosity, Alex left the office and went straight to his parents' mansion. He hoped that this conversation would bring him closer to solving the mystery, except that his father and mother were as shocked as he was. "What are you, son? What twin brothers?" Mrs. Vanessa said, perplexed. "You're our only, most favorite child." "Maybe you just misunderstood something," suggested the father. "Sometimes it happens. People are so much alike to each other that under certain circumstances they can be confused. You know, like actors' doppelgangers that they write about in the papers all the time. I think that's exactly your case." A frustrated Alex drove back home. He seemed to realize that if his parents didn't know anything about his hypothetical brother, then therefore he simply didn't exist. However, the businessman's intuition was telling him something different. The man felt that there were too many ambiguities in this story, and most likely his double did not just disappear without a trace. Perhaps something bad had happened to him, and maybe even he needed help. Alex hired a couple of reliable private detectives and started searching. He looked for his doppelganger everywhere he could, in remote villages, hospitals. He even checked all the homeless shelters in the area, but no one had heard of any Mr. William Willis. Desperate, Alex decided to check the nearest morgues, but even there he was rejected. "At least now it's clear that he's either alive or really missing," Alex said aloud to himself as he returned from another village where he had been canvassing with one of the detectives. The question invariably plagued him. Where has William, who looks so much like him, gone? It seemed to the young businessman that he was overlooking something, some simple detail that would help him find the clue. Just what that detail was, Alex couldn't figure out yet. Then his attention was attracted by a homeless man who was sitting right by the roadside, begging for alms. The man was holding an old cap with his outstretched hand. Apparently, he was hoping that one of the drivers would stop and help him. But that wasn't what caught Alex's attention. The eyes. The beggar's eyes were exactly the same color and had the same expression as his own. In moments of sadness or longing, Alex looked at himself as if in a mirror, looking at this homeless man. In addition, their hair was almost the same color, except that the beggar's was a little lighter because of the sunburn. "Mate," Alex whistled to him, "can I talk to you for a minute?" The beggar looked at the businessman and stunned. Understandably, Alex's face seemed very familiar to him. After all, it was his own face. The homeless man crossed himself and wanted to run away, but the young businessman managed to stop him. "Oh wait, don't be afraid. I won't hurt you," Alex said out of breath when he finally managed to catch up with the beggar. "Why should I?" the man asked him rudely. "I know a lot of people on the motorway who can stand up for me." "You misunderstood me," Alex interjected with a smile. "What sacrifice? I'm not a cultist or a demon, and I'm not looking for people for organs either. I'm just a man who realized he'd found his own brother." Although William's face was overgrown with a thick beard and his long hair was badly tangled, it was undoubtedly him. Alex persuaded the poor man to get into the car, promising to take him to a good cafe so he could have a full meal. Alex explained the whole situation to him and asked him what had happened to him then. "I'd love to help you," William answered him with a sigh, "but I don't remember anything. Since I came to my senses on the street almost a year ago, that's how I've been living. All right, the town's homeless guys kept me warm. Otherwise, it would have been a real drag." Then Alex pulled a photograph and money out of his jacket pocket. She was pictured with her children. He had specifically asked her to take the picture so that he would have something to show William when he found him. Taking the picture, Alex's twin brother felt like he'd been electrocuted. Memories came back to him one by one, as if someone had unlocked his memory. Mother of God, the beggar could only squeeze out Marion. The man remembered everything. Large tears immediately rolled from his eyes. The feelings swept over him headlong. William was confused and lost in thought every time he tried to tell Alex about the last days of his former life. I did work at that firm, after all, and we had an affair, William explained, but I would never betray her. The beggar sighed heavily. Marion and I genuinely loved each other. I wanted to propose to her. I'd even picked out a ring already. It was Deputy Director Peterson who forced me to make that unfortunate money transfer. If I'd known I was signing my love's death warrant with my own hands, I'd have torn him to shreds. But I didn't know anything. The deputy told me he had a lucrative contract with the foreigners. That's where the deal needs to be handled carefully, sort of like paying less tax. If that's true, why did you disappear? Why didn't you inquire about the fate of your fiancée? Alex asked him. Yes, because I didn't have time, William replied grimly. I was coming home from work very late that day. The same Peterson asked me to stay late. Had to double-check some figures on the material purchase reports. The man rubbed his forehead slowly, as if recalling the events of that fateful evening. Anyway, by the time I got outside, it was already very dark, you know. The last thing I remember is walking up to my driveway, and then darkness. I lost my memory almost completely. I couldn't even remember my name. I remember the U in my name, William shrugged. Come to think of it, I turned out to have 3 kids before I was born. Thank you for taking care of my Marion. I swear I would never hurt her intentionally. It creeps me out when I think about the long 8 months she had to spend in that hell in the colony. Alex nodded. He realized that his brother had probably been attacked with the intent to kill him. This Peterson had apparently embezzled several million, and then cleverly disposed of all the unwitting participants in the scam. Marion, as an accountant, was facing trial and jail time, and William was tried to be physically disposed of. Fortunately, they were unsuccessful. What's this coming out of? William suddenly asked him. You're kind of like my twin brother. It can't be that we're that much alike. I don't know how it happened myself, Alex replied thoughtfully, but you and I will find out. In the meantime, I think we'd better go to the police and tell them everything. We've got to get this Peterson guy before he ruins someone else's life. William liked the idea, and they went to the nearest police station, where they told everything as it happened. The law enforcement officers, of course, were quite surprised by their story, but still detained the deputy to verify the information. Under pressure, Peterson quickly confessed and gave a confession, so he was soon to receive a fair trial and a big prison sentence. Meanwhile, Alex brought William to his parents' house, where he secretly showed him his father and mother. However, as soon as the homeless man took one look at these well-groomed, beautifully dressed elderly people, his face turned dead pale. What is it? Alex asked him worriedly. It's like you've seen a ghost. Not exactly, but almost, his brother answered him evasively. And then he turned to Alex, and he noticed the look of utter bewilderment on his face. Alex, I know these people, he said. What? The businessman interjected in amazement. I tell you exactly. They're my distant relatives, old-timers. They've looked after and supported me since I was a boy. That said, I've never been a guest of theirs. Alex felt his hands go cold with shock. This was something he certainly hadn't expected from his relatives. Are you sure you're not mistaken? Alex clarified, my last name is Smith, but I've never heard of you. To be honest, I didn't know I had such a grandnephew at all, and an exact replica. Alex grinned bitterly. He understood perfectly well now that his parents simply deceived him, lied straight to his face, not being ashamed of it. I was always a distant relative to them. William sighed sadly. But can it be that distant relatives like you and I are so much alike? Alex looked angrily at his own father and mother. Well, let's go up to them and ask them about it in person. William got a little worried as he watched Alex resolutely get out of the car and slam the driver's door behind him with force. But there was nothing to do. William got out of his padded seat as well. When his parents spotted Alex, they waved happily at him at first. Mrs. Vanessa was just tending the roses in their small garden at that moment. But when she saw William beside her son, the smile slowly disappeared from her face, giving way to confusion and fear. "Well, hello, Mum," Alex began coldly, approaching her. "Look who I met in town. A surprisingly similar person to me, isn't he?" "Son, wait, what's going on?" Mr. Carl hurried over to them. Seeing William, he gave an involuntary shudder. "Hello to you too, Dad," echoed the young businessman just as sternly. "Mum and I were just talking about how you forgot to tell me about our distant relative, William. And he, what a coincidence, resembles me like a twin, although you claimed I had no brothers, and certainly no twins. Meanwhile, you've been helping William all these years." The parents didn't know what to say to this to their son. Finally, as the awkward pause dragged on, Alex asked, "Aren't there too many lies in our family? Parents, let's go inside. It's time for you to tell William and me the whole truth." "Son," Mrs. Vanessa sobbed, "forgive us if you can. You were never meant to know about this." William, struck by the full poignancy of the situation, didn't know what to say, and was it even worth it? As they made their way inside the mansion and settled into the spacious living room, the first to begin the difficult story was the brothers' father, Mr. Carl. "I don't even know where to begin, boys," he said slowly. "I guess with the fact that you're not our own sons." "How?" queried Alex dumbfoundedly. "Alas, but it's true," his father answered him. "This all happened a very long time ago. You weren't even a year old then. Mrs. Vanessa and I worked as ordinary merchandisers in the same shop in those days. There was no such thing as wealth. We could barely get by, and we were glad we did. It was very hard on us." "Alex," Mrs. Vanessa continued, "but we tried to be honest and decent people and never did anything illegal." Mr. Carl looked at his spouse strangely at these words, but said aloud, "Anyway, when we saw that burning car on the road and you inside, Mrs. Vanessa and I had no time to think. We pulled you out of the fire a few moments before the car exploded. It was a terrible and unfortunate sight at the same time. We realized you were orphans, so we decided to take you in." Alex and William's father looked meaningfully at his wife. The latter, catching his gaze, only lowered her eyes. "When we found out who your real parents were, we couldn't believe our luck at first. Terry and David turned out to be the real richest of the rich. Yes, they already had that furniture business," Dad confirmed. "And if it hadn't been for us, it probably would have been taken away by racketeers, split up into pieces. End of business. The 90s are dashing times." Alex looked perplexed at his adoptive mother and father. "So what's it come to? You took over our late parents' business. Do you realize that this is a crime, that you are criminals yourselves?" Mr. Carl raised his hand warningly. "Don't judge so unequivocally, Alex. Think about it yourself. If you had been found not by us, but by, say, child services, would you be who you are now?" The man sighed heavily. "Yes, we may have acted somewhere that wasn't entirely fair, but we truly adopted you, introduced ourselves as your birth parents' best friends. It didn't raise any questions at the time. The notary deeded all the property we had to us. This was where William couldn't take it anymore. But then why did you separate me and my brother? And why did you take the surname of our real mother and father?" Mrs. Vanessa only shrugged her shoulders. "It was easier that way. Besides, as it turned out later, your folks and I were remarkably similar in appearance. Not identical, of course, but the same type. So in order not to complicate the paperwork, we changed our modest surname Morris to the more sonorous Smith. People hardly noticed the difference. And we didn't bother to tell them who we really were. And so it was that, over time, we came to be seen as your real parents. It turned out to be very uncomfortable with William. It's true," Mr. Carl added. "Being a toddler, he flatly refused to accept us. So eventually Mrs. Vanessa and I got tired of his tantrums, showed weakness, and gave him to our friends. They had no children, and they gladly agreed to take William. However, we tried always to keep him under control, to help him with advice, not to lose sight of him. But on the other hand, he didn't have to know he had a twin brother. Mrs. Vanessa finished for her husband. By the time things had settled down, Society knew us as a one-child family. We needed to maintain that image, and we did our best to keep information about William's existence from leaking to the press. William shook his head reproachfully. "What kind of people are you?" he asked them. "They told me they were always happy to help, but not to come to your house, or your important friends might think all sorts of things. You constantly emphasized my social status, saying that I was from a poor family, and that I had to study a lot to achieve everything in this life on my own. And I believed you. You inspired me all these years. And now it turns out that you've been pretending to be someone else all this time, playing your part in public and lying to Alex and I." William jumped to his feet. The young man was overwhelmed with anger. How could you? How could you do this to us? And more importantly, why? Mrs. Vanessa, who by now was sobbing profusely, clutched at her heart. "Mum," Alex shrieked and instinctively rushed to the woman. "Okay, William, calm down. Let's not make a drama here." "Are you suggesting I calm down knowing these two are crooks? Wake up, Alex. They just stole our lives, you and me." "But they weren't the ones who killed our biological parents." His brother sieged him sharply. "If it wasn't for Mum and Dad, we might not even be alive anymore. Remember, the car could have exploded at any second. It's a miracle they were close to the crash site." "But they became father and mother to you," William said grimly. "Lived in luxury, of course, but you didn't need anything either. Didn't you have to economize on everything so that there would be food in the house tomorrow? Do you think we would have been better off in the orphanage?" Alex asked calmly, carefully pouring his foster mother some water. "Think about it. Both of us had families. Yes, even though not everything was perfect, but—" "Children, please stop fighting," Mrs. Vanessa asked them suddenly. "Mr. Carl and I realize that we have caused you a lot of pain and hurt by our actions. I think it is time for us to make amends to you." Mr. Carl looked at William with genuine sympathy. "William, from now on you can be a full owner of the family business on an equal footing with Alex. We will sign all the documents. I don't want the people who have become the closest to me over the years to continue to suffer because of me." Alex's adoptive father tried to discreetly wipe away a tear, but he failed. The first tear was followed by a second. Mr. Carl wept silently, looking at his twin sons with love and regret. "Please forgive us," Mrs. Vanessa begged them. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Just so long as you call me Mum again, Alex. And you, William." Looking at the sincerity of these people, William still forgave them just as his brother had done. After all, Alex was right. They had saved them by pulling them out of the burning car, and that was the most important gift to the boys. Eventually, William got part of the firm rewritten to him, and he became involved in the family business with Alex. As it turned out, William had an amazing flair for profitable commercial prospects. Therefore, Alex thanked fate for the fact that he was able to meet his brother. That day, when the truth was revealed suddenly and unexpectedly, William could not stop thinking about one thing: how Marion and his children were. After a visit to Alex's parents, he asked his brother to take him to his beloved, and he promptly fulfilled his request. When William timidly entered the room, holding the door so that it would not creak, Marion, immersed in her troubles, did not immediately notice him. It was only when she turned round and saw her missing lover before her that the woman cried out loudly, "Oh my goodness, William, is it you I'm wondering about?" Marion slowly approached him and touched both hands to his face. "No, love. I'm not dreaming." Tears glistened in the other brother's eyes. "It's really me. Forgive me. I'm so sorry to you." William hugged the mother of his children tightly and began to shower her face and hands with kisses. Marion was embarrassed. She realized in front of her stood her true lover and the closest person in the world. A little later, when William told her his story and explained why he had failed to protect her from Peterson, Marion nodded understandingly and said, "Now I see that you and your brother are completely different people. God, I'm so ashamed. I must have hurt him so much. I said so many nasty things to him when I came here. I can't believe he let me stay here after all that. I mean, he took my word for it and went looking for you. Absolutely amazing man, this Alex." "Yeah, my brother turned out to be a good guy," William confirmed with a smile. "He even helped me forgive our adoptees. Or rather, that's what they are to him. But to me, they've always been distant relatives." Not wanting to remember the bad things, William shook his head, as if to chase the heavy thoughts away. The most important thing for him now was to stay close to his beloved and his children, and do his best to get back on his feet. He understood that he could not live under the same roof with his brother forever. But now he had a chance to realize himself in the family business, and it was a chance he wouldn't miss. "That's your tramp brother and his wife. Are they going to live with us like that now?" inquired Trinity in a disgruntled tone the day after she and William returned home. "Well, how can you say that?" Alex became indignant. "William and Marion will be here for exactly as long as it takes. They are my family. Don't forget that, please. And show them at least a modicum of respect." "And I'm not family?" The bride frowned. "We have a wedding coming up, and it's like you don't notice anything now. No interest, only relatives on your mind." The young businessman quickly realized that Trinity was deliberately provoking him into a scandal. It was easy to imagine how she felt now that she wasn't the only one on Alex's mind. His fiancée, as it turned out, was very jealous, and that was something the younger Smith wasn't going to tolerate. "Trinity, honey," he began, "maybe we should cancel this wedding." "What?" She couldn't believe her ears. "But why?" "Because of your crazy in-laws. So tell me that this William has told you a bunch of nasty things about me. I'm sure you would never have thought of such a thing yourself." Alex only smiled politely. "It's not about my brother, and it's certainly not about me. It's about you, sweetheart. Look at you, you just can't live in peace. I really tried to live up to your high standards. But I guess it's time to face the truth. We're not right for each other." "No," Trinity shrieked angrily, "I'm not letting you go. I always get what I want, and I want to marry you." At that moment, the bride reminded him of a capricious child. "And I don't want to marry you," he answered her simply. "If we are so scandalized now, what will happen next? And haven't you thought of that? And then, I'm not a thing for you to possess. I hope in time you'll realize that this decision was the right one." Trinity wasn't prepared to put up with that attitude. Her pride made her quickly pack her suitcase and leave Alex's house for good that same day. The businessman's parents were upset at first that the wedding was disrupted, but eventually accepted their son's choice. The most surprising thing was that as soon as Trinity left, Alex's soul immediately became lighter. From now on, he decided to live a normal life, where no one would tell him what to do and how to do it, and where every decision would depend solely on himself. Sometime later, he met Cassandra. She was a nice, pretty girl of about 25. They had met by chance. Cassandra had twisted her leg trying to run across the road at a green light. When she was in the middle of it, the heel of her shoe broke, and she almost fell on the carriageway. Good thing Alex was nearby. He was the one who helped the stranger. "Let me give you a lift home," he offered. "I'm afraid with your bad leg, it's better not to walk on the tarmac here. It's time to complain to the road builders." Cassandra only laughed lightly in response and agreed to accept Alex's help. He didn't really know what it was about her that caught his eye, but there was something subtly familiar about her face. Cassandra reminded Alex of someone, but the young businessman couldn't understand who. From that moment on, he and Cassandra had a tender and kind relationship. At first, it was more like friendship, but soon the young people realized that they were perfect for each other, and sometimes they could read the thoughts of their beloved. Cassandra had a young son from a previous relationship, Kevin, who suffered from a heart defect. And Cassandra was ready to work as a nurse in 3 shifts just to raise money for the operation. Upon learning of this, Alex promised that he would definitely help the boy. "But don't worry, I will be able to get Kevin's surgery out of turn," the businessman assured the young mum. Cassandra only cried gratefully and kissed her lover. A couple of weeks later, Alex invited her to family dinner. He really wanted to introduce Cassandra to his parents, and she was not against it. However, when everyone was already gathered around the table, Mrs. Vanessa apparently accidentally dropped some of the cutlery. Cassandra bent down to help her pick up the spoons and forks. And at that moment, a small heart-shaped gold pendant fell out from behind the collar of her dress. "Oh my God!" Alex's mother exclaimed and involuntarily sat down on the edge of her chair, clasping her hands over her mouth. "No, it can't be. Not this. Not this. What happened?" Alex didn't understand a thing, Mum. Don't scare me. Mrs. Vanessa looked horrified, first at her future daughter-in-law and then at her husband. Mr. Carl, noticing the pendant, immediately turned pale. The parents revealed to their son another terrible secret. It turns out that his fiancée was their own daughter. We needed the money then very much. The mother confessed everything. So we gave our baby girl to an orphanage so she would never know who she was. Here Mrs. Vanessa burst into loud tears. How could I, God, how could I? But Alex, I had no idea how I could explain the addition of a daughter to our family, and a daughter of your and William's age. I decided I would go all the way and live up to the image I'd created earlier with your dad. I don't think I regretted it very much later, but I couldn't change anything. This is the pendant we gave Cassandra at birth, Alex's father added. It's the only one like it. I had it specially ordered from a jewelry shop. Cassandra, daughter, don't hold a grudge. We've made so many mistakes in life. I'm afraid we won't be able to undo them until the end. Cassandra only gently stroked her fiancé's parents' shoulders. Let us not suffer for what we can no longer change. Especially since I had the most wonderful adoptive parents in the world. I always knew I wasn't related to them, but that didn't stop me from loving them and them from loving me. So my childhood was completely cloudless. Alex's parents gave their biological daughter a friendly hug. Alex, on the other hand, was so shocked by what he had learned that he couldn't immediately find the right words. So that's what had caught his eye about his fiancée. That's who she reminded him of, his own mother. Still, he managed to find the strength to forgive his parents. After all, he was once again convinced that he had the most wonderful bride in the world. A few months later, Alex and Cassandra had a beautiful wedding in nature. Since they were not blood relatives, they could marry without any problems. It was the happiest day for both of them. The guests, including Brother William with his wife and children, considered the celebration to be the best they had ever been to. Cassandra's young son had undergone heart surgery and was now in perfect health. When he got older, he enjoyed playing with William's sons, as he was a frequent guest at Alex and Cassandra's house. The brothers still run a common business, and now their whole huge family is absolutely happy. Cassandra in the near future plans to open a small medical center to help women who have problems with the reproductive system. Now, having come out of maternity leave, she is actively improving her professional qualifications, hoping to help everyone who wants to have children. Why maternity leave? Yes, because recently she gave her beloved a daughter, whom the couple named Jenny. The girl is perfectly healthy and pleases her parents every day. Jason stepped out onto the balcony. He had rarely been outside lately. Unless the weather was neither too hot nor too cold, the man looked out over the tops of the sleeping trees. Buds were already waking up in some places. Spring had sprung. Soon his wife came out to him. I'm going into town. I have an appointment with a beautician, she smiled and poked her husband on the cheek. Okay, he replied without much interest. If it works out, be back by 3. The doctor's coming in today. I'll try. That's it. Bye. Jason watched Emily get into a red Mercedes and drive out the automatic gate. His malaise had turned into a real sickness. Someone shouted to him from the street, "Leave the old cherry tree alone." There are almost no buds on it, all fallen off, he showed with his hands. First her, and then me, Jason whispered to himself to remind himself that he didn't have long to live. Over the past few days, the man had been thinking more and more about how he had taken a wrong turn once in his life. Yes, he, like everyone else, thought that happiness was in the money. He put a lot of effort into becoming a big man, and then it all came crashing down in an instant. Your liver's failing, the doctor told him at the time. You need serious treatment. And he was treated for 2 years, but there was no improvement. Jason was feeling better, and then he was getting worse. It wouldn't have mattered if it wasn't for the constant pain. It was unbearable. His liver was checked many times with tests and biopsies. No cirrhosis was found, but the organ refused to function normally. The day came when Jason stopped trusting conventional medicine. A good friend recommended an old Chinese man who practiced acupuncture. Oh, it's bad, the grandfather said, examining his eyes. Liver's all bad. Jason shrugged. The old Chinese man fussed around him, inserting needles in various places. The patient cried out in pain. "Be patient," the grandfather said. In a way, the Chinese man helped him get to a stable level from which there seemed to be no escape. Sure, Jason was fading, but not so fast. The grandfather did perform a miracle, but unfortunately the cure never came. Almost 6 months passed after that, and Jason was just waiting for his turn. "I wish I could live to see the fall," he muttered. "I want to remember this summer so much." He pressed his forehead against the glass, glanced at the clock. Hannah was supposed to be here now. Jason wasn't hungry, but he needed to take his pills, and they weren't supposed to be taken on an empty stomach. And sure enough, 2 minutes later there was a knock on the door. The landlord invited him in. "Jason, I brought you breakfast. It's 10, the girl smiled. "Good, Hannah." He took a seat at the table. Thanks. He remembered the gratitude as the girl deftly began taking dishes from the tray. "It's nice outside." He sipped the water following the pills. "It's warm today, just right for spring. Can you feel it?" Joyful Hannah replied. "John said he'd be sawing the second cherry tree, but he asked me," the landlord replied. "If it's withered, what good is it? Maybe the weather will get better. Will you go outside then?" Maybe. He sighed and started on his breakfast. Hannah went out. Jason preferred to spend his meal alone. Half an hour later, the maid came in, cleared the table, and he lay down. Here it is, the summation of 20 years of struggle. The feeling of superiority, the joy of being able to achieve something in life, he reasoned. You can't take anything to the other world. That truth is so simple, but for some reason no one thinks about it. Jason remembered himself at the age of almost 30, an energetic, young man who would stop at nothing to get his way. He was quickly noticed his tongue in cheek. Beautifully spoken words became Jason's calling card. But along with this, he had a big problem. The chief's wife fell in love with him. She was in her 40s, but she was still as fresh as ever. When Jason was young and thought that life existed to get something out of it, he started having an affair with Jessica. It was like the woman had lost her mind. She was willing to do anything for a guy, even leave her husband. For a year, their passions boiled like red-hot lava. Jason was sure he'd met his woman too. To be fair, Jessica had helped him. She had some good connections and had helped his wife start his small business. He quit his job, but with it went his passion. Or rather, the chief's wife had grown cold to him. Maybe she was feeling emotional because she felt threatened. Or perhaps she wanted to punish her husband in this way. Nevertheless, Jason was at first very worried that his beloved had left him, and then he saw the possibilities. In return for his love for Jessica, he got a small electrical store and some money. That was enough to get him started. After about 4 months, Jason came to his senses and looked around. It seemed to him that he could move on. So he did. His store expanded. Within a couple years, he was already competing with the average retailers in his town. Of course, he made connections, paid whoever he needed to pay. In general, in 10 years, Jason was already a pretty solid man with a good profit. He didn't want to get married. It was enough for him that he was constantly changing his partners. He valued his freedom very much. Besides, his position required that his wife be a real lady, at least in appearance. That's why Jason didn't marry for the first time until he was 45. Then Amber seemed to him the best candidate. Despite her 22 years, she looked like a woman with dignity. That appealed to Jason a lot. He didn't mean to, he just liked women who could present themselves, show strength and their worth. He sighed. He felt like he was a completely different person back then. "John, I've already sawed the cherry tree," the man told him. Yes, the girl sighed in the same way. "John, I feel sorry for him." She hugged her husband. "Jason is a kind man." "That's true." He stroked the girl's head. "I'll be sorry to leave this place." A year and a half ago, a couple came to this town to earn money. By some miracle, they'd managed to get into Jason's house. His wife didn't want them, and she was too arrogant, but the owner insisted. He liked these young people. They seemed open and friendly. And the husband and wife turned out to be hard workers. "I don't want to leave here, either," Hannah said. "We're so lucky to have him. And I'm used to the house. I think Amber will kick us out when he dies," John said sadly. The mistress never hid her dislike of the servants, especially the girl. The young people did not know where she came from or where she was born. But rumor had it that Amber was also from the common people, a bit of a self-promoter for the role of the society lady she played all the time. She was beautiful. She was almost 40 and looked about 10 years younger. Why she and Jason didn't have kids, the couple didn't know. Nobody did. Someone just kept coming up with more and more theories. John left. Hannah started cleaning. They had a gardener working at the house. He usually started his season in mid-April and finished in the fall. Michael worked twice a week. Then there was the cook and his assistant and another cleaner. John and Hannah lived with Jason all the time. The rest of us had our own work schedules. The beginning of April was very warm indeed. Hannah put her face up to the sun. She was 23. Like anyone her age, she dreamed of having a house and children. That was the purpose of her and John coming here. Of course, they'd already saved some money. But it wasn't enough to buy a house in the city. Jason's house was in the suburbs. It was quiet. If the servants needed anything in town, the owner's driver drove them, or they took a cab. The old grandfather had long since retired, but he would come by his former master's request with his car and do his job professionally. Even at such an advanced age, Hannah didn't notice how quickly the time flew by. She stopped when the doorbell rang. The doctor must be here. She remembered what her host had told her, and ran to meet him. The doctor said hello. He and Jason exchanged a few words about the weather, and he headed to the second floor. Jason was already prepared. There was one thing that confused him. Amber never showed up to talk to the doctor. An hour later, the guest left the patient's home and went to his apartment without much emotion. "Yeah, nothing's changed," Jason said with frustration. Then there was no hope. He lay down, his mind reeling with thoughts. But what hurt him the most was his wife's neglect. He closed his eyes. A young Amber stood before him. Oh, how beautiful she was. They'd been introduced to each other at a rich man's birthday party. Amber was single. She was friends with the birthday girl's daughter. The girl chose her friends very carefully. You could say that Amber made up every move she made. She hadn't barely escaped the small town to go back there. Only a big city with prospects appealed to her. Amber relied on her looks. She always looked good. She was willing to spend the last of her money not on food, but on cosmetics or accessories. Of course, on Amber constantly drew attention not only young people, but also middle-aged men, even those who were already in age. But she was waiting for her prince on a white horse. The three young men killed themselves, kneeling, swearing eternal love. But Emily remained quite indifferent to them. Two of them had good prospects in the future, but that was not enough for the girl. She wanted a ready-made option, so that the man of her dreams was fully provided for. He didn't have any problems, and she would agree to such a man. To such a man she was not sorry to give herself. So Amber waited. And that day she finally met him. After meeting him, her friend whispered in her ear who Jason was and what his condition was. To Amber, her words were like a balm to her soul. She was fine with it. She kept catching glances from her new acquaintance and playing along. She didn't want to miss the opportunity, especially since he wasn't married. After this meeting, the man invited Amber to an expensive restaurant. They got to know each other better. The girl deliberately did not want to immediately let the man near her. They dated for about 6 months. Then they started having an affair, and with such passion that Jason immediately asked her to marry him. How much I dreamed of her, made plans, dreamed of children, Jason said. But it didn't work out. In fact, everything he dreamed of back then never came true. 2 years later, Jason finally realized that his self-control hid a basic lack of decency. Amber was too cold for family life. She didn't want children, and she was always busy with herself. He was ashamed to admit to himself that he'd made the wrong choice. His wife wasn't the right person for him, but he couldn't break off the relationship. Jason was too proud at the time to admit his mistake. As time went on, Amber lost interest in her husband. They lived separate lives, nothing to connect them. A couple of times the husband tried to talk about children, but Amber immediately stated that she would not give birth. The reason for her decision she did not explain in any way. "I don't want her to get all my inheritance," he whispered. "She hasn't earned it. It's enough that she's lived as she wanted all these years, never paid for anything. I'll write a will for some orphanage or hospital for the seriously ill like me." After the wife neglected her husband that day, he took great offense to it. Amber didn't work anywhere. She could easily reschedule her appointment at the beauty parlor, and there was no need for her at all. "She doesn't need me. Why lie to myself?" I was hoping that after she found out about my illness, at least something would change in her. But no, Jason thought. People like her have no sensitivity to others. They're like parasites, selling an imaginary benefit, but in reality, all they do is live at other people's expense. The man's anger began to break through. What is it about her that makes her act like that? Nothing. She's a stupid fool. You can't even talk to her about serious topics, simply because her brain is so underdeveloped that it only revolves around a couple areas in life. Emily is cunning, but now I see how primitive her cunning is. Meanwhile, Amber walked out of the beauty parlor. She was pleased with the treatments she had gotten. She thought her face looked better, and she looked good in general. She was the type of woman who had no passion for intimacy with men, nor did she enjoy romance. Amber was cold and calculating. No, she never cheated on her husband. For one reason only: she wasn't interested in sex. She didn't desire anyone. Maybe only once when she was young. Then Emily was madly in love with her classmate. For his sake, she was ready for anything. But he chose another. The girl decided that in her life there would be no more feelings. Behind the outer mystery, there was a dislike of men. And Emily did not like children. She would not go to the point of giving birth. She cared about her figure, and she didn't need a child. The whole meaning of her life was all about herself. The woman jumped into the car. She remembered that the doctor was coming to see her husband today. So what? Lately, she'd been wishing it was over. Amber was becoming the sole heir to Jason's fortune. And then she was planning a reorganization in the house. I think he's already left. She glanced at her watch. She didn't feel like showing up home early. She pulled up in front of the large two-story house. There was no doctor's car at the gate. Amber sighed contentedly. It was so hard for her to play interested in her husband. And then there were the constant doctor's visits. Hi, she walked over to Jason without enthusiasm. How'd it go? Amber, I asked for you to be present. Her husband replied sharply. You don't have to act like that. Your face is gray. Do you want to take out your anger over the doctor's words? She calmly replied. Jason, I am not to blame for your illness. His wife turned around and walked away. You idiot, her husband shouted after her. But that's it. I won't feel sorry for you anymore. Amber didn't hear his words. She didn't care what her husband wanted her to do. The last time she talked to the doctor, he'd given Jason 6 months. The woman didn't want to waste any energy on him. You bitch. I'll baby you all. Jason couldn't calm down. His liver ached again. He gasped for breath. It seemed to him that Amber, the snake that had taken up residence in his organ, had eaten his entire liver from the inside out so that all he had to do was die. The disease quickly put everything in place. What Jason had kept from himself for so long became obvious. In the 2 years of his illness, Amber had confirmed all his hunches. What had he been counting on? Why did he think he'd be the one to melt this woman's heart? After all, throughout history, many men had tried to do it, but none had succeeded. Beauty that kills, he scolded. Amber could be called an insidious killer. His wife didn't want to stay home for long. Besides, she knew her husband was nervous the day the doctor arrived. She changed her clothes and decided to hit the boutiques. The woman didn't waste time for lunch. She wanted to stop at her favorite restaurant. She got into the car, inserted the key. The car started to hume and then stalled. She did this several times. The Mercedes wouldn't start. Shit, the landlady blurted out. She got out, opened the hood. She didn't know anything about cars. John was watching from the side. He finally took pity and came over to her. Can I help you? The guy smiled. Amber looked at him unhappily. John didn't wait for an answer. He looked under the hood, rolled up his sleeves, started picking at the Mercedes. Amber, try it, he shouted. She sat down behind the wheel, and oh, miracle. The car started. John's eyes lit up. Amber never thanked him. The guy stayed standing, and she quickly drove out the gate. Building through himself, he reprimanded himself and went to wash his hands. He was a little offended. The mistress could have thanked him for his work, but it was beyond her dignity. Amber twisted the steering wheel nervously. Everything annoyed her. She wanted to throw out all those maids and make her own rules. After her husband's death, she'd planned to have a recruitment contest. Everyone had to be beautiful, have refined features, and a good figure. In general, her servants had to resemble Hollywood stars, not country simpletons. Amber stopped downtown in front of the mall. This was where the most expensive boutiques were located. The woman smiled in anticipation. She was a regular customer and had already accustomed the salespeople to how she should be treated. Immediately, a beautiful young woman ran up and began to favor her. An hour later, the customer was satisfied. She picked up 2 large bags and tapped her heels to leave the boutique. And then her favorite restaurant was waiting for her, and so were the familiar waiters. A young man bustled in front of Amber and complimented her every now and then. The woman bathed in his attention. She liked such moments. The only thing she didn't like was when someone crossed the line and started talking about personal matters. The guests glanced around. The decently dressed gentlemen were looking at her intently. Amber smiled contentedly. There was still a charm about her that attracted the eyes of the opposite sex. It was from a man sitting at a neighboring table that Amber's waiter brought Amber a very expensive wine. Thank you, she blushed. Thank him for me and please let him know I'm married. Apparently the man regretted very much having spent so wantonly. He quickly paid and left the restaurant. Amber sipped the expensive wine with pleasure. It was really great. She really didn't want to go home. They rarely talked to her husband on the phone. Was Amber getting used to her single life as much as she could? Yes, not only did she not suffer from it, she longed for it with all her soul. Amber drove into the yard. It was already dark. She glanced at her watch. The little hand was almost to 8. John was doing something in the yard. Amber, as usual, decided to walk by. Ouch, the boy suddenly exclaimed and squeezed her hand. Amber stopped in hesitation. What? Are your fingers frozen there? She asked and walked over to John. He showed a bloody finger. Okay, I'll get your wife now. She's gone, the young man said faintly. Would you mind bandaging my hand? And I, either with disdain or arrogance, replied the landlady. She slowly, the situation was not arousing any positive emotions in her. Please, we need to treat the wound. Please, the young man uttered. Amber and John walked to the kitchen. He showed them where the first aid kit lay. Amber's dress was too expensive to ruin. She bandaged the guy's arm from a distance. Thank you, he thanked her, though the bandage the hostess made wouldn't last long. The woman left everything on the table and went to her room. She was tired of it all. I wonder if she even has a soul, John uttered through the pain. She's not even touched by human suffering. Half an hour later, the wife arrived. She rebandaged her husband's arm, stroked his head to quiet his pain. I don't know how she decided to do that at all, Hannah said in amazement when she learned that Amber had done the bandaging. Yeah, I asked her several times before she agreed, he sighed. How does he even live with her? I mean, she's a heartless woman. I'm the one who's so lucky to have you. He kissed Hannah. You're my gold. Hannah herself realized how lucky she was to have John. He didn't drink. He didn't smoke. He carried her in his arms, literally. John was a great guy, and he was willing to work hard for his family. That night, the young people talked about their masters for a long time. They fell asleep after midnight. Amber did her evening ritual. She stopped by Jason's house and said goodnight. Her husband didn't say anything back. He was very angry with his wife. He thought Amber had crossed all the red lines. She was treating him like he was dead in front of him alive, showing her lack of care and interest in her husband too openly. Jason decided to call his lawyer the next day. He was going to divorce Amber. With those thoughts in mind, Jason fell asleep. He really wanted Amber to finally be punished. He realized that he had raised this snake himself and fed it all this time. But as the saying goes, I bred you, I'll kill you. The next day, Jason was visited by his lawyer. Anthony was a young professional, but had bailed out the owner so many times that he didn't want to change him. Good afternoon, Hannah opened the wicket. It's been a long time since you've been to our place. Oh, Hannah, I'm always busy, laughed the young man. And how are you doing? How's John? We're all right, narrated the girl on the way to the house. We're worried about Jason. Believe me, it's not a personal interest. We're very lucky to have him. Yeah, Jason's a good man, Anthony agreed. Well, see you around, Anthony waved as he walked up to the second floor. I cheered the landlord. Thanks for coming on short notice. He hugged his guest. Jason had often told the lawyer that if he had a son, he wanted him to look like Anthony. Well, I'll drop all business for you, Anthony cheerfully replied. I hope the doctors have reassured you. Unfortunately, no, Jason interrupted him. I'm too serious to keep dreaming. I called you in to talk about my wife. The conversation was a long one. Half an hour later, Hannah brought them tea and dessert. Still, the men were still unable to come to any common ground. You see, if you divorce her now, she'll take some of your property. And it doesn't matter that she never worked and lived off you. I suggest you write a will. Jason really wanted to get rid of his wife, maybe just to get back at her. He envisioned Amber leaving his house with nothing. But Anthony's arguments were too convincing. Okay, he exhaled. I don't know how I put up with her. I wanted so badly to die in peace and quiet. It wasn't easy for Jason either. He set himself to kick Amber out. I need to think about the will, he said at the end of the conversation. Anthony, I'll call you then. In his 32 years, Anthony hadn't often met such reasonable and honorable clients. Besides, Jason was dear to him in a human way. Will you be long tonight? Hannah went to see her guest off. Is Jason doing well? He smiled crookedly. So Hannah, was good to see you. He held out his hand to the girl. Hannah sighed sadly. Anthony had always been kind to them, didn't discriminate because of education and connections, and they were simple people. Yes, Hannah didn't leave for the kitchen. The cook asked her to help him clean up. The helper's gone with the driver to the market. There she is. Look at her. The cook reprimanded angrily when they saw the landlady in the window. No hello, no goodbye. How long have I worked here? I feel like I'm a mop, not a human being. Not once did she ever talk to me properly, but how to start a scandal if she's in a bad mood? That's the only thing she's always for. But lately, Amber hadn't touched anyone. She was waiting for her husband to die. And then we'll all roll out of here, the man's side. I'm sure she won't leave any of us behind. Amber went outside to work. John, the gardener, hadn't gone to work yet, so she had to do his tasks. Hey, you come here. Amber suddenly called out to him. John hesitantly walked over to the car. I think I have something knocking. Can you listen to it? I don't want to drive to the shop today. I can, the boy hesitated. Only I've got to drive. He added unhesitatingly. The hostess moved into the passenger seat. John squatted behind the wheel. His hands nervously gripped the steering wheel. He pressed the pedal, and the car drove smoothly. Then John added gas, listening for a strange sound. The car jerked, and the driver barely swerved to the side. Amber collapsed on top of him. We need to look. Pressed the brakes on the young man. I wouldn't advise you to ride her. How am I supposed to drive it now? Amber wondered. Can you take me to the shop? I protested something immediately. The guy inside might have misgivings, but he silenced his inner voice and smoothly drove the car toward the highway. Amber didn't speak to John the whole way. He pulled into the shop. The foreman immediately stated the cause of the breakdown and told him to leave the car. Is that a cab fare for you? Amber handed the guy the money. The amount was more than he needed. Their eyes met by chance. John. He barely spoke. Thank you. The young man had never thought his mistress could behave like that. The fact that she had given him 10 times as much as he needed for the cab seemed to him first a coincidence and then a show of gratitude. She has given you so much. Hannah could not believe her husband. I can hardly believe it. Hannah. Who cares? He hugged her. We need to think about us. And he put his hands on her stomach and about our baby. I'm so afraid to tell anyone that I'm pregnant yet. She said excitedly, or the landlady will fire us early. I'm not worried about Jason. But Amber, yeah, maybe she's not really as bad as we think she is. Her husband shrugged. God knows what's on her mind. The incident with the car had somehow gotten Amber closer to John. At least he was no longer afraid of her. 2 days passed. The landlady showed up in the yard with her car. John was hobbling nearby. For the first time in all this time, the landlady called his name. Come here. The young man dropped the rake and headed toward her, going over in his head the options of why she was calling him over. Look at this, Amber smiled. I'm going to ask you to put your hand over hers. All right, he stammered and got in the driver's seat. A moment later, the engine hummed. John listened intently. Everything seemed fine to him. He drove back and forth across the yard for a couple of meters. Amber sat next to him. But what? Questioningly, she looked at the guy. You think everything's okay? John nodded. The woman quickly pulled a wallet out of her purse and slipped him $5,000. You don't have to, he denied. It's not like I did anything. But Amber put a finger to her lips to silence him. Smiling contentedly, she got out of the car. John stared after her. He couldn't understand what was going on with his mistress. No one knew about it except Amber. By some coincidence, she suddenly looked at her employee and saw that he looked a lot like her classmate Peter, her first love. It was then that her car broke down. What moved Amber then? Lost feelings of happiness, curiosity, or desire to experience a long-forgotten feeling again. But the woman felt strangely drawn to this young man. She couldn't lie to herself. That day, it was as if some valve had opened in her that had been blocking her breath all these years. She just wanted to fly. Amber, overjoyed, went back to her room, her heart singing. She opened her closet, looked in the huge mirrors. She was pleased with the way she looked. Pretty girl. She winked to herself. Why? Do I have the right to have fun for once in my life? She laughed loudly. The woman's eyes burned like a cat's eye, a devilish fire burned in them. Amber took off her hairpins, unraveling her gorgeous hair. Why waste such beauty? After practicing her seductive face a couple times, she reached into her closet and began trying on her many outfits. She had a goal now, and she was going to do whatever it took to fulfill it. No one and nothing could stand in her way. Amber had wanted a man's love for years, craved it passionately. Her blood was boiling in her veins, and she was ready to get John by any means necessary. Unfortunately, the latter had no idea that he was now a red rag for his mistress. Perhaps if the young man had been more experienced with women, he never would have fallen into this trap. It was almost 10-0 when Amber looked out the window. It was the third time. John looked around. There was still no one in the yard. But where is she? He thought angrily, when she doesn't have to hang around there forever. His thoughts were cut short because Amber appeared. John grabbed his bag lightning fast and ran downstairs. Amber was carrying some old boards. "Can I see you?" She waved her hand at him, and he came right over. Not really. He didn't like that. This was the second time the landlady had given his wife money. And John was glad of it. It seemed he deserved a little extra on his paycheck. "Good morning." The young man smiled broadly. "Do you want me to take a look at your car?" "No, I want you to come with me." "No," she said in a beautiful voice. "I need your help." The woman added more softly. "Okay, I'll just warn my wife." John answered her and ran to Hannah. She gave him a stern look. She really didn't like the whole thing. But if I say no, God forbid, she'll fire us. What would we do then? Her husband looked her in the eye. "All right," she said through her tears. "Please don't show your face to her again. I don't like all this very much." John raced back with an arrow. Amber was already on her way, waiting for him on the street. She'd only thrown her passenger a few words. He didn't seem particularly eager to talk to her. She threw him a questioning look. "You want to know where we're going?" "To the store?" She laughed. "I need a loader today." "Okay," John said timidly. "What do you need to haul?" "Furniture." He encouraged the conversation. "No, my new clothes." The landlady kept her eyes on him. The boy froze in his seat. He didn't know how to react. Maybe it was a joke. Nevertheless, he agreed and fell silent. The car stopped outside a shopping center. Amber started rummaging through her purse, pulled out an expensive cell phone, and ostentatiously got out of the car. As she did so, her body bent so that John had a chance to see all of her rounded form. The guy blushed. "Let's go," Amber smiled. "I definitely can't do this tonight without you." She winked enigmatically at the young man. John felt out of place. They walked into an expensive store. Amber showed him a seat. He took a seat. Then the hostess began to pick out clothes, accompanied by a counselor. "What do you think?" John heard a voice as if from far away. He was completely immersed in his thoughts. Standing before him was Amber in a gorgeous dress. She had let her hair down to complete the picture. Her shoulders were bare. "Good," bewildered the young man. "I'm sorry," I blushed. "I'm not good at this," he said. "You just tell me, do you like it or not?" Amber demanded. John nodded. "I'll take it right away," she told the salesman. About 10 minutes later, she showed up in her new outfit. John wanted to get up and leave, but the hostess grabbed his arm just in time. "Stop," she commanded. "It's a job, so sit and watch. I'll pay you for it. Cash motivation." There was a little less of the pragmatic John's fervor. The hostess's second outfit didn't appeal to him. "Screw it." She laughed and handed the salesman the clothes. "We'll take the next one." So in almost 3 hours, John had chosen only 3 outfits for his mistress. "And you have good taste." She complimented her assistant when they had already gotten into the car. "Well, John, such a thing. We should celebrate." Before he could object, Amber steered the car toward her favorite restaurant. "To good taste," she raised her glass. John sat looking around. Richly dressed people were eating everywhere. He sat in his work clothes and looked rather silly in his eyes. "Don't worry so much," Amber took his hand. "I'm my own man here, so no one will say anything about you. I'm sorry, but I have to get back. I have a lot of work to do." Tried to walk away, John tried to leave. He was ready to go home and at his own expense. "Eat first and then I'll call you a cab," Amber said seriously. In this, she didn't fool him. The guy was already getting in when she touched his arm. "Thank you," she pressed her fingers lightly against his palm. "It was really nice spending time with you." John quickly slid into the cab, his hand burning with fire. The young man sensed the danger that came from his mistress. All he wanted to do then was run away from her, but John was constantly haunted by her scent. "What does she want from me?" he thought as he sat in the cab. "I'm not her errand boy. I work in her house. But I'm not a slave. Besides, I have a family." John gave Hannah the money she had paid him today. "Mistress so much," she repeated in confusion. "John, what have you been doing?" The wife became even more agitated. "Were you carrying her bags?" He answered unhappily. Can I come to my senses? Her store makes me dizzy. John decided that the next time the landlady approached him, he would refuse her at once. Let her do what she wanted with him, even kick him out. Amber returned home and walked over to her husband. He said hello through gritted teeth and pretended he didn't want to see her. Okay, have a good night, she smiled. I hope this night will be your last, she thought to herself. Emily was lying in her bed and John was standing in front of her. She was frantic to see him. She needed him. What can I think of tomorrow? She thought. Gotta show myself in all my glory. All my life I've dreamed of this boy. She wasn't embarrassed by the age difference or the fact that John was married and his wife worked in her house. It was like she'd lost her mind. She needed him now. I want him, she whispered and smiled sweetly. After that idiot dies, I'm going to live here with him. I'll kick everyone to hell. I'll hire a decent maid, and he'll stay with me. Since the woman dreamed of Hannah. She was up most of the night. She was having mood swings and insomnia because of her pregnancy. She went out into the yard. It was cold, tangled in her jacket, sat down on a bench in the garden. I'll talk to her, Hannah decided. There's no point in dragging my husband back and forth. I may be thrown out, but I won't let her play with my John. The next few days were very hectic and the lawyer came again. He and Hannah talked a little. The girl didn't know that time the landlord had written a will for all his property to a foundation that dealt with seriously ill children. Hannah fiddled with the master that day. He looked pleased. In fact, Jason was very happy that he would punish his negligent wife in this way. He had no idea at the time how drastically things would change. Jason asked her to stay with him for a while. Meanwhile, Amber approached John again. He looked at her unhappily. I don't feel well, she whispered. Could you take me to the hospital, please? Yes, of course. The young man jumped up to her and took her hand. He got behind the wheel, and the car started slowly toward the hospital. John kept glancing at his passenger the whole way. Amber did look pale. Are you okay? He asked her. She nodded. I'm okay. Shouldn't we call an ambulance? No, Amber waved her hand. I'll be fine. She was flattered that John cared so much about her. The guy helped the woman up to the doctor's office. He nervously paced the hallway when she came out. He immediately asked how she was. The landlady reported that she was better. She actually got a blush on her cheeks. I'm craving ice cream. And to go for a walk, she suddenly asked. The guy parked outside a small cafe. Amber was almost healthy by now, ordered an ice cream for herself and for him too. She ate with great relish and told him something. John looked at her in bewilderment. His hostess looked like a little girl and laughed all the time. And she is pretty. A thought flashed through his mind. If I had met her before, I would certainly have paid attention to her. It was as if she had read his thoughts. We are all different when we are young, she sighed. I would like to feel carefree and free again. What gave you that feeling then? John asked her. He was interested in talking to the new Amber. You wouldn't believe it, she laughed. We went out on the town a couple times a year, and the first place my parents made sure to take me was the carousel. Yes, he laughed, but it's very easy to organize. There's a nice park here and you can ride the merry-go-rounds. Then let's go. Amber jumped up and grabbed his arm. Before John knew it, they were on their way to Central Park. Amber was driving. She was thinking about something the whole way. John looked at her and couldn't figure out what was wrong with her. Her cell phone rang. I'd be right there. It's a little chilly, he said. Come on, I'm here on business. Are you with her again? Hannah shouted into the phone. But John had already hung up. The guy didn't want to lie to himself. He was enjoying the company of his landlady. They rode 3 different kinds of merry-go-rounds until Amber got dizzy. All right, that's enough, she said in a commanding voice. Let's go home. She got behind the wheel and they headed toward the suburbs. But halfway there, the woman pulled over and began kissing John passionately. To his horror, he didn't resist. I love you. She pulled away from his lips. My boy, I promise you will be happy with me. John was silent. He refused and asked for a ride home. Amber realized that she needed to take things step by step. She stopped at the beginning of the street and drove off again. She was insanely happy. She really wanted to get to the most important part, but it was necessary to make John fall in love with her enough that there was no turning back. She was too careful to mess it up. John went to bed. But he didn't give his wife all the money his landlady had paid him today. He put most of it away in his stash. Hannah fell asleep, and he couldn't sleep a wink. Amber's happy face was in front of him. The guy felt like he'd never experienced anything like it before. With Hannah, they were more like friends. Their family life was based on very simple principles. But Amber was overwhelming him with new emotions. He wanted to run somewhere. Perhaps the word inspiration could describe his state of mind. The next day, John woke up and felt goosebumps running down his back. He was insanely anxious to see his mistress. He deliberately did something in the yard, and Amber still wouldn't come out. She was watching him from the window, and she liked the fact that he was always looking around. Satisfied, Amber walked over to her husband. She was in a good mood. "Jason, does my approaching death cheer you up so much?" Amber said, instead of greeting her husband. "Jason, I want to take care of you." "Do you?" Amber played. She stood for a moment and left his room. Maybe she was up to something, he wondered. I know her too well. I'd seen her like this the last time I'd asked her to marry me. Jason was 65 years old, and he had a good grasp of human psychology. She must have found a man, he concluded. But, he smiled, "Don't even think you're getting anything." Amber went back to her room and changed. Tonight she was going to shine. She felt the climax was near. "Good morning." John came running up to her. "If you need any help, just let me know." "Yes, after lunch," she said casually. "John, I need you to come with me to a place." He touched his lips and tasted again the kiss that had been left on his lips from yesterday. Amber had just wandered around the stores and had breakfast at a cafe. She was already itching to meet John, but she waited. "Yes, the best room ever," she confirmed. "E40 p.m. please, 2 o'clock. Stopping by the house, she picked up her boyfriend and asked him to load some things into her car. Hannah stood watching her husband run around the yard. "Husband, I'm going to have a good coven tonight." The girl headed toward the landlady. "Amber is going to get me now. You and all these things are in the workshop. There are people to pick them up because she's going somewhere." "I don't know," he lied. Hannah stopped, kissed her husband on the cheek, and headed into the house. And John, satisfied, sat down in the front seat. They were pulling away from the house when Amber threw the steering wheel and passionately pounced on him. This time, the guy was actively participating as well. Half an hour later, they were already at the hotel. Amber didn't care what anyone thought of her. She and her guest went up to the room. There was already champagne and fruit on the table. To a good evening, she raised her glass. "I hope we have a nice time." John's whole past life just faded away. It seemed to him he simply hadn't lived before. The contrast was so huge that the guy dissolved simply in his passion. Such a storm of emotions he had never experienced before. Amber stroked his head and said affectionate words. John lay there with his eyes closed. "Why did you choose me?" he suddenly asked. "Especially since I'm married." He turned to her. "Because you're different," laughed the hostess. "And also because I love you. I think we're made for each other." "What about Hannah?" He suddenly remembered his wife and blushed. "What's going to happen to her now? She'll be all right too. She'll meet her happiness. It's just that we won't say anything to anyone yet. As soon as my husband dies." She fell silent. But John understood what she was trying to say. At that moment, he was so lost in unreality that he couldn't even guess who he was or where he was. He was so caught up in his passion that he couldn't see his life without Amber anymore. Hannah seemed to sense something wrong right away. First of all, she didn't like the smell of champagne. John very rarely drank, mostly wine at the holiday table. "John, what's wrong?" His wife asked in excitement. "Have you been drinking?" She kept her eyes on him. "That's enough," he pronounced. "Can you imagine my luck today?" One was introducing himself about his wedding. "The guys poured me a glass, too." "All right," Hannah said with resentment in her voice. "John, I'm scared. I think something is going to happen." She pressed herself against her husband. "Yeah, it's going to be okay," he kissed her, but only Amber was present in his mind. What John wanted then? It's hard to say. He was generally living in some sort of fantasy world at the time. He thought of nothing but his mistress. The main thing was that she promised him that everything would be fine, and how he was not interested. The guy also did not think that even if the master died, Hannah had to leave this house if he stayed. Where would she go with a child? "I'll give her all the money," he decided to himself. Maybe Amber will add some of it too, so Hannah can buy her own house. That was the end of John's thoughts and plans for his life. As long as Amber was with him, the rest didn't matter to him. 2 weeks passed. Hannah felt coldness from her husband. From the experience, she was put on conservatorship. That's when everyone, including the master and mistress, found out she was pregnant. I don't care. Amber tried to keep her cool. In reality, she was really angry. You're still going to stay with me, aren't you? She covered her face with her hands and cried. What's wrong with you? John put his arms around her. I only love you. Do you want me to tell Hannah all about us? No, she answered at once. Let my husband die first, and then I'll tell her everything myself. A little over 3 months passed. Jason decided to walk to his room where he used to conduct his business. It could have been called a study. Its windows faced the high neighbor's wall. There was almost nothing to see there at all, except a couple of trees under the window. The man spotted 2 people, took a closer look, and almost shrieked. Amber and John were standing against the wall where no one could see them and were kissing passionately. Oh, shit, Jason scolded. She's completely out of her mind. You crazy fool. Hannah's going to have a baby soon. At first, the owner wanted to call his wife in and make a scene, but then it would have been revealed that he'd robbed her of everything, and she'd have nothing when he died. Amber could instantly file for divorce and take a decent chunk of his estate. What am I going to do? He pondered. God, what a pity, Hannah. Poor girl. That's right, it dawned on him. Jason called Anthony at once. He arrived a couple hours later. Wow. The man was surprised to see Hannah's belly. I didn't know you were having a baby. Congratulations. Thank you. The girl stroked her belly. Anthony, it's been so long since you've been here. We miss you already, she said. I promise I won't be missing you again. He laughed. The girl led her guest to the host. He asked for tea to be brought to them, and Hannah set the table and left. Anthony, I'm asking for your help in a very delicate matter. The client's voice trembled. The lawyer looked at him intently. He had no idea what Jason was about to say. I want to sign my house over to Hannah, he said abruptly. We can do that. We need to get Ashley and her husband involved, Anthony clarified. He began to think of different options in his mind. Though on her specifically, the host replied dryly. You see, it was painful for him to talk about it. Anthony, my wife is having an affair with John, he admitted. I don't care. I've got one foot in the grave. Hannah, on the other hand, has had some bad luck. How so? The guest opened his mouth in amazement. She's pregnant. I saw her today. That's the problem. She doesn't seem to know anything, he sighed. Anthony, I want to help this girl. Besides, I feel kind of guilty about her in a way. But you didn't put your wife up to her husband, did you? The man threw angrily. Wonder if he fell for her in the hope of getting your property. The lawyer felt like cursing, but he had long ago been able to keep his temper in check in such situations. Bastard, he whispered as he walked to the window. What's going to happen to her now? The man was quiet for a moment. He liked Hannah. She was like a pure tear. Oh, and John seemed like a decent guy too. But right now he was ready to punch him in the face. Okay, he approached Jason again. Bring all the paperwork over tomorrow for her to sign. I want to leave her some of the money, the man added. She'll have to raise the child alone. Anthony came downstairs. He was all pale. Hannah came up to him at once and smiled cheerfully. What's the matter with you? The girl said involuntarily. Is Jason doing so badly? No, he suddenly took Hannah's hand. It's going to be okay. He ran his other hand through her hair. We'll see each other again soon. Anthony was acting strange somehow. He didn't usually take such liberties, though the girl sensed his behavior as a friendly gesture. It seemed to her that he knew something that she certainly wouldn't like. While John was saved by the fact that his wife was pregnant, she wouldn't let him near her. She got into moods easily, so he tried to keep his hands off her. No, have you seen her today? The wife said suddenly. Dressed up like a doll. Walked past Lauren and me, flashed a grudging smile, left. Who? Emily. John blushed and corrected himself. Amber. Anna somehow didn't notice it. Yeah, well, playing the hell out of it. The wife replied grudgingly. She's not worth a damn herself, is she? I don't know. John wanted to avoid the conversation. John, Hannah, screw her. He waved his hand. Let's go to bed. 2 or 3 times a week, John went out for a couple hours on a coven. His master would let him. Hannah didn't know her husband went to Amber's hotel. He always brought back good money he supposedly made when he returned home, so up until that point, Hannah hadn't questioned any of it. But 2 weeks after Jason wrote the will for the house, the thing Hannah had been dreading happened on her. John went into town for work. Hannah got a call from the health clinic telling her to come right away. There was some kind of test missing. Either the girl had forgotten about it last time, or she hadn't been scheduled for it. She managed to get out of the office in time and headed for the exit, realized she couldn't take public transportation. "I'll stop by the market," she thought, "and then I'll call a cab." The bazaar was 50 meters away from the polyclinic. It was hot. It was approaching September. The girl stopped in the shade of a large store, sitting on a bench when she heard joyful voices. Hannah thought the man's voice sounded familiar. She turned around. There was a familiar car in the back row and beside it. Oh my God, she almost fainted when she saw her John kissing Amber and quickly jumping into the car. Hannah's trembling hands tried to press her husband's number, but he didn't answer. The girl began to pant from the stress. Her stomach felt like it was squeezing. "Calm down," she ordered herself and breathed deeply. "It's all right. I was just imagining it. She needed to get home and she would be safe there." She lay down on the bed and cried bitterly. That's how John found her. Rushed to his wife at once. She could not say anything to him for a long time. "I saw you," Hannah said at last. "Did you kiss her, John?" That's why. She turned her face in. All the more for her, the husband was silent. He couldn't look his wife in the eye. "I love her," he finally said, breaking Hannah's heart in half. "I can't live without her." "Oh my God." The girl covered her face with her hands and cried even more. "What about me?" John didn't answer her. He ran out of their room. The girl got out of bed and, as lost, went up to the second floor. She beat her fist with all her might at Amber's. "You bitch," she screamed at the whole house. "You stole my husband. Get out." A moment later, the door opened and Amber appeared in the hallway. At first, the grin stayed on her face, but then the woman became seriously frightened. Hannah clawed at her hair, and they began to fight. Amber had one big advantage: she wasn't pregnant. Jason came out screaming. He realized what was going on. The whole house was buzzing. Before he could get to Hannah, she shoved Amber as hard as she could, sending her flying down the stairs. John showed up in the doorway as well, helping his mistress up. Hannah walked up the steps. Jason was in great pain from the excitement and could barely make it down to the first floor. No, Hannah blocked the car. Her husband wanted to leave with Amber in. John quickly ran out, pulled her aside, and the car drove out the gate and into the street. "No," Hannah sobbed. "John?" And everything went black in her eyes and she blacked out. When Hannah came to, she realized she was in the hospital. She started to feel her stomach in terror. The baby was still there, and she sighed. Half an hour later, a nurse came to her, and in the evening Anthony appeared in the room. He tried to speak as calmly as possible. Jason couldn't make it, and he wasn't feeling well either. The girl turned her back to the wall, crying. The pain was unbearable. The lawyer waited a few minutes. "Hannah, I have some very important and bad news to tell you," he finally said in a trembling voice. Hannah turned to him abruptly. There were tears in her eyes. Anthony waved his hand. He wanted John to answer for everything, but not at this price. "Was Jason dying?" Hannah asked. "No, it's not about him," Anthony answered, and then he was silent again. It was too hard. "Did John and Amber crash?" Hannah persisted. "No," she shouted across the room. A man ran up, pulling her against him. Someone brought cold water. "Did he make it?" After a few minutes, she asked. Anthony shook his head negatively. Hannah became really hysterical. She was given an injection and fell into a dream. "God, it hurts so bad," Anthony whispered, stroked her hand. Before leaving the room, Jason lay on his bed and cried. He really hated to end his life like this. Of course, he dreamed of getting rid of Amber, especially after she seduced Hannah's husband. But that she'd done it, he had no doubt. As the investigator had told him, John had been driving, stressed out of control. They went full speed into the ditch. The car was thrown high into the air, flipped several times. Both of them died on the spot. Jason felt he didn't have long to live. His nerves were on edge. The events of the last few days had taken the last of his strength. He wanted to go to Hannah, but he couldn't even get out of bed. He realized that he still had to get through the funeral. He would naturally not be able to go to the cemetery. In fact, all these matters were now handled by Anthony. He contacted Gregory's parents. He had to tell them everything. His father and mother took him in themselves. They didn't want to make a big deal out of it. No one came for Amber. So Anthony had to organize everything himself. Daniel was admitted for observation. Of course, she was in her 8th month, and there was still a chance that if she didn't make it and gave birth, the baby's life could be fought for. But the doctors did everything they could to make sure she carried the baby to at least 8 months. The tone was very strong. Somehow, Jason made it to the day of the funeral. In the evening, he was taken to a hospice for the critically ill. Anthony was torn deciding his affairs. He drove to the hospital to see Hannah. She was also visited by the boys. The cook kept sending her normal food by courier. All in all, everyone sympathized with the girl. Congratulations. Anthony held out a huge bouquet to Hannah and blushed. He had come to pick her up from the maternity hospital himself. Hannah didn't realize the change that had taken place. After his wife died, Jason had written a deed of gift for the share. She was now sole owner of the house. Everyone already knew about it except her. "It's such a shame we don't have Jason with us," the girl said sadly. "He did so much for me." "Hannah, believe me, he did a lot more for you than you realize," replied the lawyer enigmatically. "I'm very glad you've come to your senses." In passing, he threw in, "Anthony, thank you too." She touched his shoulder. "You've turned out to be a true friend." The lawyer lowered his eyes. He had liked Hannah for a long time. He certainly didn't want to take advantage of her today. The car pulled into the yard, and there were already guys standing outside. Hannah gave her son to Anthony and began to hug everyone. The man was afraid of the baby at first, but then began to stroke him lovingly. "Wow, Anthony, you look just like his daddy," the cook joked. "He let me take a picture of you." Everyone went into the house where a large table was set up. Hannah put her son in the stroller. He was sleeping soundly. Anthony asked her to talk to him alone. Everyone knew what he was about to say to her. "Hannah," the man looked her in the eyes. "This house belongs to you now. Jason has deeded it to you, holding out all the necessary paperwork," you said. "I don't want it that way." "May," Hannah immediately protested. "Anthony, let him come back. I'll make sure he spends his last days in joy. I don't want anything from him," sobbed the girl. "He'll be here in about half an hour for the papers." He cast a glance at Hannah's cell phone and paced nervously around the yard. Finally, someone honked, and the gate opened. A special car that transported the sick drove in. Jason was sitting in a wheelchair. Hannah immediately rushed to him and fell to her knees in front of him, kissing his hands. "Please stay," she begged him. "We need you. I need you, my son." Hannah sobbed. Jason couldn't help himself. He wiped his eyes now and then. "Are you like a father to me?" She hugged the man. "I will take care of you until your last breath. Please make me happy. All of us." All of his servants crowded around the former master. They all looked at him with eyes full of pleading. The decision he had to make was a very difficult one. The man had already let things go and wanted to leave quickly, but Hannah gave him hope, albeit briefly, but still happiness. Jason's attending physician had agreed on one condition only. He now had round-the-clock care from 4 nurses who rotated constantly. Hannah would bring the baby to Jason and place him in her arms. He was overjoyed. In fact, it was Hannah and her son who prolonged his life back then. Yes, it was only 4 months, but it was a kind of happiness Jason had never felt in his entire life. With Amber gone from the house, it was as if the tension was gone as well. The housemates were having fun at work, and all of the staff visited Jason every day. They talked to him, sometimes having tea together when he was able. Hannah really kept her eyes on her beloved Jason. Despite being a small child, she fussed around him all the time, most very often, perhaps 3 times a week. John also came to visit him. It was as if he, too, had become a full member of their extended family. "So," Jason said, "John, I don't have much time left. I want to leave everything to Hannah. Let her decide what she wants to do with all my money." "Hannah is a bright person," John replied at once. She doesn't want your money. She's taken over your house." "I mean, John, she's like a daughter to me." He wept. "I really want her to have a reliable man in her life." Lance, the lawyer, blushed and lowered his head. Jason almost jumped out of bed. John, he couldn't believe his hunch. The man kept his eyes on him. Yes, I've been in love with Hannah for a long time, he admitted honestly. Only she doesn't know anything about it. That night, they had a serious man-to-man conversation. Jason was sure of John, so he would have married her to him immediately if she'd agreed. It was late when Jason called Hannah back to his place. He had decided to have this conversation, after all. Hannah, daughter, look at me closely, he said to her. There's something I'd like to ask you. It's about John. Hannah was confused. Her heart was pounding frantically in her chest. She was afraid to even think about what Jason would say to her now. You're a grown woman, and I don't want to tell you what to do, he sighed. But if someone asked me what kind of husband I'd want for you as a father, I'd choose John. Hannah, he loves you. And he loves your son too. For nothing. Not because you're the heir to a great fortune. I think I love him too. She lowered her eyes. John is a good friend. He's reliable. That's good. Jason cheered. Daughter, listen to me. You're going to be happy with him. I can feel it. It's a well-known fact that people in my condition are very intuitive. The wedding wasn't lavish, but it was attended by everyone close to me. The bride and groom's parents came. Everyone was happy. Early the next day, Hannah walked into Jason's room, and the nurse was asleep. She immediately realized that something had happened. His body was cold. Hannah at first wanted to scream out in pain, but she glanced at her former master's face. He was smiling like an angel. That's how happy he was buried. It was always covered with a kise, this mirror, like a dead man in the house. If you came very close, you could see your reflection under the light-thin cloth. In general features, but 3 times a year, when the kise was removed to wash it, before New Year's Eve, Easter, and the first day of fall. The woman who did it tried to turn away or lower her eyes, so as not to glance inadvertently at the mirror. Shortly before her grandmother died, Anastasia received a letter from her. Come. The house is yours now. Remember about... And then there was the drawing so familiar, the frame, and of course the mirror, what the hell. Anastasia had no intention of coming before, as her mother had done in her time. She was the first to flee the old house for good, breaking tradition. When the eldest in the family died, the next one took her place. The words home and clan had always been synonymous in their family. The house was built by my great-grandfather to a certain extent. The only important thing is that the house was born in the 18th century, and before it stood in a large village on a hill by the river. Then with time the river became shallow. A dam was built above, and now it was necessary to go down and walk far to the water, and the village was gone, and the town crawled close to the house and was already licking its eyes at the old building, already sending people to buy it for nothing and then tear it down. And don't be such a steely character of grandmother. In a word, all those who rolled their lips had to admit, yes, the monument of culture and the house itself and the garden around it, with arches, arbors, grottos, and fountains, too. Well, the mistress is an old woman, so we just have to wait. Her grandmother knew that she could not bequeath her estate to her daughter. She shivered at the mere memory of the house, with its traditions, silence, and things that gave her goosebumps. She ran away from it, as they say, with lard on her heels. In the end, my grandmother called Anastasia, and she came. She didn't intend to leave Paris, didn't want to return to Russia at all, but everything coincided. Her husband's betrayal, a long and painful divorce, her life shattered into shards, and Anastasia packed her bags. She knew what she was doing. The house demanded a renunciation of everything else. Serving it was becoming the main meaning of life. So in essence, in the state she was in, she had 2 options: to kill herself, or to stretch the process out over time, to let the house do it. Anastasia chose the latter. But now, 20 years later, she knew that her ministry was over because she had no children, and everything would be over with her. Those who would come here later might want to turn the house into a hotel or a museum, enchanted by its antiquity. The weather vanes on the turrets, the stained glass windows, the carved doors, and the black stone slabs. But the house won't allow it. And when the new owners realize this, having suffered 33 misfortunes, they will simply tear down every last bench, and there would be a wasteland instead of a house, a blank page of sorts. Anastasia hesitated further, though. Maybe the strength of the house is not in itself, but in the place on which it stands, and no matter what they built instead. And then Anastasia had a dream and realized it was too soon to despair. The one she wanted would be here soon. Only the dream was strange. Anastasia wasn't supposed to tell anyone about the new mistress of the house. But even if she did, there was no assurance that life would be as peaceful as before. The house had a premonition of something. It's still vague. That fall my mother decided that they would winter at the dacha. Mom adored the dacha and the places around it. In general, it was a privileged place. It was a peninsula near the dam, which used to be a real island before it was built. One side were locks, motor ships, barges, yachts. On the other side was the river and the mountains behind it. My mother was once lucky enough to buy a plot of land and a dilapidated house cheaply from a woman who was leaving in a hurry, and she had to get everything done one day. Since then, from early spring to late fall, my mother worked here with enthusiasm. Every spare, and even not quite a spare rubble, went to work. But now there was a 2-story house, and the flowers delighted my soul until the snow came. In November, my mother always said goodbye to the dacha with regret, as if it were a living person. She walked around the house, stroked the walls, patted the door as if it were her own shoulder, and promised that in April there would be a new meeting. And this time she said, "You know what I'm going to do, Maggie? I'm going to winterize this place for you and me." Basically, the idea wasn't so crazy. Mom only needed the internet to work. The cottage had a great stove and several electric goats, so no one would freeze. The only thing was that almost all the dacha owners were leaving, and the store they had here was closed until the next warm season. "It's okay," Mom said. "I'll go grocery shopping once a week on a donkey." Donkey, she called their old car. "Well, you'll have to put up with your girlfriends," my mom continued. "You'll go to daycare for 2 days anyway, and then you'll be sick for 2 weeks. You don't get cold so easily. You're a hardened little man, but all these viruses." So they stayed and wintered well. Maggie didn't even notice the loneliness. It turned out to be happiness not to rush to kindergarten in the morning, but to lie in bed and look at the drawings on the carpet. Her eyes transformed geometric lines into fairy tale characters. Outside the window, it was slowly getting light. The outlines of trees were coming through. My mother was calling for breakfast. And the air was dizzyingly clear. The smell of strong coffee thickened, became palpable. The golden, sunny circles of scrambled eggs my mother sprinkled with green onions that grew on the windowsill, and the slight burning of its taste was a premonition of spring. And on New Year's Eve, the two of them hung twinkling curtains of garlands in the garden, and everything sparkled and shimmered like a fairy tale. But then, as if they had conspired, they turned off the unnecessary light, and then the stars shone brightly in the sky, and the thin sickle of the month promised them riches in the coming year. They only had to show him the silver money. They didn't go inside for a long time, mesmerized by the beauty of nature, and only when they were completely frozen did they come back to sit by the fireplace. Her mother brewed some willow tea, which grew in the neighborhood in summer. And she kept Maggie awake, telling her witch tales for a long time, because New Year's Eve was a special night, and it was not supposed to be the night for sleeping. January, with its many festivities, slipped by, and in February the snow began to drizzle, and Mom made friends with the snow shovel, because otherwise they would have been prisoners of the cottage, unable even to reach the driveway. In March, near the spring, Maggie found the first flowers of the Mother Nephew, and in April, trouble came. Then they said it had never happened before and would never happen again. An accident at the dam. The one that rose above their peninsula. Dacha dwellers always waited for spring with apprehension. The hydroelectric power plant began to release water, and the amount of water it would release depended on whether it would flood the neighboring small islands, and whether the water would reach the houses and cellars. This rarely happened, and when everything dried up, the dacha owners had to start repairs. It was believed that the dam had a safety margin for generations to come, but no one could have predicted that there would be heavy rains in the upper reaches of the river, and the snow would melt so rapidly, and the hour would come when all the gates would be open, and the water would rush over the top, flooding everything around. The evenings were already long, spring evenings, and Maggie had gotten out of the garden unauthorized. It was a loophole she could not see from the house. She was going to look at the river water always fascinated her, and at this time, when it was swirling and foaming near the dam, when flakes of foam were carried by the current, especially at this time. So at this time she found herself at the water's edge, Perhaps if she had been older and looked to her right, she would have had enough sense to realize what was happening and had a couple of minutes to rush to the higher ground. But she didn't realize, didn't notice, didn't understand. And when the water surrounded her, picked her up and carried her, she was saved only by the fact that she knew how to swim. Of course, in the icy river, she would not have lasted 10 minutes, but next to her was the river's spoils, logs, planks, all sorts of junk. And you cover, maybe from someone's cellar, which became like a raft for her. There could not yet be any help. Those people who had just seen the flood were still recovering or calling any emergency services. And the water was so cold and the wind so scalding, when darkness began to fall before her eyes, Maggie only had time to wonder, could night come so suddenly? She felt sick. It was very hard to breathe. It was as if there was not enough air in the air. Someone's hand lifted her up and held her upright, but Maggie couldn't even hold her head up straight. It kept falling on her chest. "Have a drink," said the woman's soft voice. She tucked pillows under Maggie's back, made her comfortable, and sat down on the edge of the bed herself. "We have to move around a little bit, or we'll get congestion in the lungs. You have to finish this one." Every last drop. It was very difficult, because after each sip, Maggie fell asleep, or more accurately, fell into oblivion. In the end, the woman took pity on her and let her lie down as before and didn't bother anymore. But from that day, the first time Maggie drank from the cup, she began to recover. Now, every now and then she woke up, looking at the objects around her and the woman who came toward her as soon as Maggie opened her eyes. She was tall, very thin, wearing a billowing dark dress. Her hair was combed smoothly into a knot. Her face was so stern that she seemed incapable of smiling. But sometimes she did smile, and when Maggie asked for food, she blossomed. She brought an egg on a little tray, some breadcrumbs, a cup of tea, and she started spoon-feeding Maggie. She put a breadcrumb on the spoon, dipped it in the yolk, and brought it to her. "Come on, come on." Maggie felt that her teeth were soft, not even strong enough to chew dry bread. Still, her strength was returning, albeit slowly. The first question Maggie dared to ask, "Well, where's Mom? Where's Mom?" The girl didn't ask, neither what had happened, nor she was now. If her mother were around, none of this would matter. The woman brought her a newspaper. Maggie wanted to say that she could read only a little, and then only when the words were printed in big letters, and preferably those words should be short. But the woman did not suggest that she read. Then she unfolded the paper and showed her the pictures. There were many of them, and one was worse than the other. Maggie didn't recognize her Dasha village. It had turned into a garbage dump. Ruined, mangled houses, puddles of water everywhere. "Mom," she asked pitifully. Lemon shook her head. It could only mean one thing. Mommy was gone. 6-year-old Maggie experienced such an acute sense of loneliness that it took her breath away. It was worse than when she was choking on pneumonia. Not only was it hard to breathe, but now she didn't want to live. "My name is Anastasia," the woman said. "You won't be alone, don't be afraid. You will be with me." It was a few more weeks until Maggie began to wander around the house, familiarizing herself with it. At first, she had to cling to the furniture out of weakness, but the faster her strength returned, the farther she traveled, exploring her new possessions. She liked the second floor best, a sunlit corridor with a view of the garden. Maggie opened the doors of the rooms one by one, and in each one she found a treasure. There was a piano, an ancient one, with candelabras and candles. There, a carpet, which was like a painting. A Turk in a turban was looking into a gazebo, where a beautiful girl was lounging on a sofa. Blessed that one of the doors was locked. The key was sticking out, though, and Maggie turned it carefully. She didn't expect to be able to handle the lock at all, but the key turned easily, and Maggie entered the room. It was almost empty. At any rate, the furnishings were most ascetic. A desk over which hung an old black radio, a stiff chair in which it must be very uncomfortable to sit, and Maggie thought it was the bride's veil, white, thin, on the wall. She touched it and heard a warning voice. Don't bother him unnecessarily." The girl recoiled. Instinctively, she realized that she had done something unauthorized and would probably be scolded. The key in the door was there for a reason. Of course, it was not allowed to come in. Still, she couldn't resist asking, "What's in there?" Anastasia lifted the edge of the kersey, turned it slightly away. Maggie saw the carved wooden frame. The wood had long since darkened. The frame was very old. The less you talked to that mirror, the better. Anastasia didn't scold her. Her voice sounded trusting. "Anyway, it'll all be yours later, and you'll understand. In the meantime, don't come in here anymore, okay?" She wasn't ordering, she was asking. And Maggie nodded in agreement. There's plenty of other rooms in this house to run around in, and walk as much as you like in the garden. But wait here, don't come here. Anastasia locked the door with the key and put it in her pocket. But not once since that day had Maggie even tried to break the ban. When she was older, though, it would have been easy to get to the room, like climbing that tree that grew under the window. But Anastasia didn't go there herself, and so there was nothing particularly interesting to see. The world that existed for Maggie now was limited to the house and the huge garden, surrounded by a high stone fence. She wasn't bored. It really was a whole world. A special man came to tend the garden, and it was always beautiful. Lots of secluded corners where you could hide from prying eyes, if there were any, and a little pond where you could feed the fish in the summer, and a swing, as if it were just for Maggie. Lots of roses, even green ones. The gardener was an old man, and he often stopped work to rest. At such times, Maggie would sit beside him, and he would tell her stories. She was especially fond of animal stories because the gardener gave the animals an almost human mind, and ordinary-seeming incidents turned into real tales. A cow and a pig conspiring to go to a faraway land, a dog performing real feats to save his owners. Maggie's eyes lit up. She would never leave Stephen Swan's side. In the long fall and winter evenings, Anastasia taught the girl various magic tricks. Modern people no longer spend time on this. Magic tricks belong in the circus. But Maggie had deft hands and a sharp memory. They started with different card games, like the simplest one, when one person chose a card and returned it to the deck, and the second had to guess what card is conceived. Then Anastasia started to show how to make an object disappear in your hands. There it was, and it's gone. There's the mirror for tricks, too, Maggie asked. You know, the one in the closed room? Sorry, do you know about the crooked mirrors? Anastasia asked. Maggie shook her head. She had not had time to see this generally antiquated amusement. Like all girls, she played dolls, and the simplest games on a tablet. Then I'll show them to you first, Anastasia said, and then we'll talk about what you want to know. From time to time, they made outings. Anastasia realized that it wasn't entirely safe. What if someone she knew asked her about the girl, or if someone from Maggie's former life recognized her? The search for those who had died in the flood had long since ended, and Maggie was numbered among them. If it had turned up otherwise, Anastasia would have gone to jail. It wouldn't have saved her from joining the angels if she hadn't pulled her out of the water. But Anastasia took the risk, and every now and then, of going out on the town with the girl, always away from where she lived, always for a little while. And when she and Maggie returned, both of them always felt the strangest feelings. When they opened the gate, it was as if they were stepping from the present into a past where roses bloomed and swings swayed quietly, where the fast, nervous 21st century had no entrance. Anastasia drove a machine that was older than herself. But Maggie was cared for like a living thing, and she still lived, and she drove them leisurely to wherever they wanted to go. This time they went to the park. It was not a work of designer art, but an old amusement park in the suburbs, a kind of excursion. Young people, like birds on perches, sat on the backs of benches, putting their feet on the seats. Along the alleys, the kids were taken on a mini steam train with tiny open cars. There were Devil's Wheel and Daisy and Illusion, in which it seemed that you were turning upside down and the ceiling, which should be at the top, was floating under you. The room of crooked mirrors was not popular and was empty. A full-figured woman, the one checking tickets, was bored beside her. Maggie instinctively sensed that Anastasia attached great importance to mirrors, so she squeezed her older friend's hand tight in the surty. In vain. There was not a single person inside. Sunlight poured through the small windows in the ceiling, and dust flecks danced in it. Mirrors stood in a row, and Maggie moved from one to the other, watching her face and body change as they stretched, widened, and undulated. It was amusing, but no more. Maybe if the boys had been in Maggie's place, they would have laughed and pointed fingers at their supposed ugliness. But it took more than that to make Maggie laugh. The girl turned back to Anastasia and looked up at her, question. "It'll make more sense to you now," Anastasia said demurely. "In the meantime, let's go." They spent another hour or so in the park. They rode up on the Ferris wheel. Maggie felt as if the wind that ruled the city could pick her up and carry her as easily as it carried the painted autumn leaves. At an outdoor cafe, they ordered large portions of milkshake, Maggie a strawberry, Anastasia a chocolate. It was fun to dip the straw into the lush foam. In short, it was a wonderful day. And when they got home, Maggie never mentioned the mysterious mirror. In fact, she had forgotten all about it. She had enough to do besides. She was tired and slept so soundly that she didn't seem to move once during the night that she realized in the morning that her back and neck were stiff. However, after breakfast was over, Anastasia told her herself, "My DPHMs." Maggie realized what it meant and jumped up eagerly. When they reached the door that she had not opened since that one time, Anastasia unlocked it, took the key out of the keyhole, and put it in her pocket. "I won't lock it again." They stood at the mirror. Anastasia hesitated a little and, lifting the Keisel, threw it over the top of the frame. It was a rather large mirror, allowing me to see myself full length. It was a little tarnished from time, but otherwise it looked quite ordinary. The frame was the only good thing about it, the carvings so finely carved they were uncommon nowadays. A real weave of wooden lace. Maggie hesitated for a moment. She didn't understand why. She began, eventually, but she stopped her. "Look at our reflections," she said. Maggie began to gaze. Of course, her gaze was fixed on herself. After a while, she began to think that the girl reflected in the glass was more beautiful than she was. She had unusually smooth skin, and it was as if she had a slight gold cast to her skin. Maggie's features hadn't changed. It was undeniably her, but there were accents. There was a strength in her gaze that had never been felt before, and her whole appearance had taken on a marvelous harmony. It was hard for Maggie to take her eyes off her reflection. That girl in the glass was so good. She shifted her gaze to Anastasia's reflection and almost gasped. The simple face had turned into a countenance. A thin nose, perfectly shaped eyes, but there was no color in that face. It was waxy. Mirrors would do better if they reflected more. Or thought, Anastasia said thoughtfully. It's a French poet's phrase. It can be translated either way. Now look at this. She stepped back to the desk, where a chocolate-colored plush album lay on the table. Anastasia flipped through the pages and pulled out a photograph of a rather handsome middle-aged man. She turned the picture over so that the mirror would reflect it. A few moments passed and the man's face changed. His cheeks pulled back and sagged slightly. His lips curved. His gaze became different. It was the same man, but now his face was a complete reflection of his character. Overbearing, self-centered, intolerant. "That's my ex-husband," Anastasia explained. "Oh, but how does a mirror do that?" Maggie was amazed. "I don't know." Anastasia replied simply, "In my memory, it's always been there. Maybe it's older than this house. Maybe my great-great-great. I don't know how many times great-great-grandfather brought it from somewhere. But when you look at it, you start to see the real you. You can't hide anything from him. There are no secret movements of the soul for him. And I can't even tell if it will stay that way if you take it out of the house, or if it's the other way around if this place gives it its power. But there are two things you need to know that I will tell you. First of all, you can't take it out in public. It'll all be over at once. People will rush like vultures to investigate it, refute its power. Some will admire it, others will laugh at it, and it won't stand for that. That's why I showed you the crooked mirrors. If someone sees it by your carelessness, try to defend the mirror, say that it's just crooked, a toy for the public, and hide it the first chance you get. Secondly, avoid looking at him too much yourself. The longer you stare at him, the more power will bind you. What will happen to you? It's hard for me to describe. One time when I was looking at the mirror for a long time, it was as if something from it was transmitted to me. After that, when I looked at people, I could read their minds. I thought I was going crazy. I hung up the mirror as before and hardly ever went into that room, and gradually it went away, but it was scary to feel such power. It is not given to man, and he must not trespass on it. Maggie looked around with the directness of a child. And all the things in here are magical, right? The table and the chair. Anastasia grinned slightly. What magic? It's something that really exists, but we can't yet understand it or explain it. The table and chair are just ordinary. Only this, she tapped her finger on the radio, is a funny thing. It looked like a very ordinary, primitive device. Black plastic on the back, and the front part was white, slightly dusty. A frequency scale, a white wheel. I wouldn't turn it on. Anastasia said, "Mo, with it, you never know what you might hear. Most of the time, it's just noise interference. If you rotate the dial slowly, you can get to a popular song or news, but sometimes voices begin to sound. Sometimes surprisingly clear, you can even hear the speaker's breathing, as if he approached from the other side and whispers in your ear. Sometimes the voice is distant, and it's not easy to distinguish the words, but it's always people who are no longer in the world. You know, there are things like dreams or warning dreams. This is kind of like that. And you don't just hear it, you have to interpret it correctly. Radio is a thing that should not fall into the wrong hands. Can I? Maggie's lips quivered. Can I hear my mom through him? Anastasia looked at her strangely. Baby, it's never by choice. It's always random. You don't get an answer to your direct question. At least I've never been able to do that. Well, let's give it a try. Maggie was ready to beg. Anastasia sighed and stuck the plug into the socket. Maggie's nerves were so excited that she flinched violently as soon as the receiver came to life and hissed. Anastasia spun the time-darkened wheel slowly, lightly touching it with her index. Weather report, wheezing again, an old song about a truck driver wheezing, whistling noise, some sort of prize draw show, the deliberately animated voice of the host, failure, complete silence, and then a cold voice devoid of any intonation said, Metro. Now, Anastasia was already flinching. I don't think we'll hear anything more today, she said, but Maggie knew she would obey Anastasia and not disturb the mirror again. But if this room was not locked, she would sneak in from time to time and touch the wheel, move it a millimeter at a time, a fraction of a millimeter at a time, hoping that she might hear her own voice, that she might be able to send word, and not once did it happen. At first, Maggie found an opportunity to come here every day, if only for a few minutes. Then, frustrated and disappointed, she opened the door once a week, no more often. Songs replaced the news, sometimes bird song, sometimes a measured noise, as if there were a sea on the other side. And rarely, there were strange, ragged words spoken in a foreign voice. Words that Maggie didn't think had anything to do with her. Eventually, it became a tradition for her to come here 3 times a year. On her birthday, on her mother's birthday, and on the anniversary of the day the water washed away what had been their peninsula, took away all her former life. Not only did Anastasia keep Maggie out of school, she tried to make sure as few people as possible knew the girl lived here. Anastasia started teaching Maggie on her own. She did it responsibly. Textbooks and the internet were helpful. She had to scribble down a lot of penmanship before she developed a beautiful handwriting. How many books had to be read before reading became a necessity for Maggie? She taught her French for fun, and so she wouldn't forget the language she said. And by the age of 16, Maggie was already fluent in 2 languages, almost mastered the high school curriculum. Oh, math, what a torture you are. Razor blade and the intricacies of gardening were not forgotten in tricks. Here the girl's abilities were undoubted, at least in the circus, to perform. Shortly before her death, Anastasia gave her one last gift. She went down quickly and unexpectedly to everyone. Anastasia had always been thin and never had a blush on her cheeks, but it seemed to Maggie that her older friend was as eternal as this house. She couldn't imagine her life without Anastasia, and the woman had never caught a cold in her memory. How had she gotten pneumonia without ever having been anywhere without freezing? But Anastasia came down with it all at once, in one day, and with the same fidelity as a beast senses the approach of the end, she realized everything about herself. Once a doctor was called to the house for once, and he administered treatment without anticipating a bad outcome, without even talking about a hospital. But Anastasia told Maggie, who was caring for her, "Sit down, I want to have a serious talk with you." Maggie was frightened. She'd seen that look on Anastasia's face only once before she'd taken her to the secret room. She noticed that there were folders on the chair next to the bed. Apparently, the sick woman had somehow made it to the closet, where she kept documents and other important papers. "I blame you," Anastasia said. "I raised you like a Mowgli. And I'll tell you, because you can't lie to me anymore, that I did it not so much for you as for myself. I don't know how your life would have turned out, but if you'd been orphaned, I don't think they would have given you to me. There's so much paperwork, a line of people who want to take a child into a family. If I'm orphaned," Maggie repeated slowly, separating one word from the other. Anastasia nodded. "I forbade myself to learn anything about the fate of the flood victims. You were sent to me as a sign from above. At least, that's how I understood it. I don't have children, and this house should go from my hands to other loving hands. That's why when you came here, I was as quiet as a mouse under a broomstick, and you and I began to lead such a reclusive life. Tell me, honestly." Anastasia touched the girl's hand with her thin and this time very hot fingers. "Have you felt bad with me all these years?" But Maggie was in a state of complete confusion. What if her family was alive and her mom was alive? Was that why she had never heard her mom's voice on the radio of the dead? Anastasia interpreted her silence in her own way. "I understand," she said. "Just know that I loved you very, very much. Like the daughter I never had. Okay, there's no time for feelings, so let's get down to business." Maggie couldn't help but hear Anastasia's heavy breathing. It was as if the woman was short of breath. Later, Anastasia, she didn't notice that it was the first time she had called her older friend so affectionately. "Don't do it now. You don't have the strength to talk." "There's no later. Look at this." Anastasia untied the first folder. "These are your documents. I paid a lot of money for them, and I don't think anyone will question their authenticity. But if you want to, if life works out that way, you can get real ones someday. In the meantime, here's your passport, which says you're Taylor Maggie, your high school diploma. We're almost through high school. In short, these are the first things you'll need. This is my will, and I give you this house. When I die, it will take effect. Next is a bank card. Don't lose it. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to get you by. There's a PIN code written on the envelope. You must memorize it." And this Anastasia put the last folder in Maggie's hands. "This is sort of an emergency airfield, the little apartment where I lived before I got married. Now it's yours. In case something happens to the house, they take it away from you, you'll still have a roof over your head. You don't have to take anything from here then, just 2 things. You know what they are." Anastasia leaned back on the pillows and took a few minutes, covering her eyes, trying to regain her breath. "And not to frighten you, but I must tell you about it too. Don't worry about the funeral. Our gardener will take care of everything. Your business is to enter your rights as an heiress as soon as possible. It shouldn't be too difficult. I have no other relatives." For the first time in Maggie's memory, Anastasia was wrong. At first, however, she didn't care about that. Left alone, she felt a real, great grief, perhaps even greater than when she'd lost her mother as a child. Anastasia had been her whole world, and now that world was dead. Maggie really didn't have to worry about anything herself. All the trouble of the funeral was taken care of by others, both the old gardener and the staff of the bureau. The funeral service was held in the farewell hall. Maggie realized that Anastasia didn't want to let any extra people into the house even after she died. There was a tired, stern face in her coffin, and it seemed to Maggie that now Anastasia was listening to someone, to them, the living, invisible, and what he was saying she did not like. To the girl's deep sorrow was joined also anxiety. And when Maggie went back to the house where she had spent most of her life, it seemed vast, desolate, and gloomy, a veritable crypt. Never before had it evoked such associations. Fleshing what Anastasia had feared began almost immediately. Someone was keeping a close eye on the old manor, and they weren't about to let it fall into the hands of a young owner. Word subway came up again. The very first word she had heard on the old radio. The city was about to build new subway lines. In this connection, people living in old houses were decided to be resettled. They said that these buildings would not withstand the underground works. But one could not think that prestigious places in the center would be empty. They would be sold at a triple price. The houses would be demolished and replaced by company offices and shopping centers. The settlers will be sent to the suburbs. They're going to build economy-class high-rises especially for them. And the mansion where Maggie lived fell into one of the new neighborhoods planned for construction. She was a pain in the ass. Maybe there are some states in the world where old houses whose owners don't want to give in to change are left alone, and new freeways circle them, and neighboring huts with futuristic buildings. But this was clearly not the case here, and Maggie began to receive commissions which could not be prevented the more these people behaved in a hostile manner. And the end of land committee inspector, a skinny, tall man with a small bird's head of some kind, told Maggie, "You will be compensated. The cadastral value of this house is not very high." He mentioned a ridiculous amount. "You can, of course, sue, but you will only lose time." "You mean they'll take the house away from me?" Maggie asked naively. Her interlocutor shied away from answering. "You should look for a new place to live," he said. "You realize that the urban development plan has to be fulfilled." Maggie didn't listen any further, but the gardener told her that evening that there were rumors that the authorities had other plans. "It's a very nice house. You can't find a house that old nowadays. They'll tell Maggie it's not a cultural monument. Or maybe they won't even make any excuses at all. A lonely girl, and a quiet, shy one at that, is no match for them. And here, it seems, they're going to make a hotel. A river nearby, a small park in the garden. Old windows will be replaced by plastic ones." Maggie even shook her head, imagining this picture. And even before she started the fight, she realized she was going to lose. People came every day now. They seemed to have things to do, some to sign, some to clarify. But Maggie knew they wanted to see the inside of the house. Anastasia wouldn't let anyone in to see if there was anything to eat. "You won't sell these chairs?" asked the visitor. And the statuettes. A vase. Things a lot. It is unlikely that you will buy yourself such a large apartment to fit in it all the good, and in the antique store to drag far in troubles. Let's give you a good price right away. Maggie didn't have a shred of commercial savvy, and she still didn't consider herself an antique owner. Anastasia was. There was only one thing Maggie felt responsible for, and that was to remove what was in the secret room. She still hadn't let anyone else in here, though there had been people who wanted to. "What have you got in there?" Another guest pressed the doorknob seemingly casually. "Nothing. My personal belongings," and Maggie touched her fingers to reassure herself, touching the key that was now always in her pocket. And then the guy from the land committee told her that the will was invalid for some reason, so the house would go to the state and Maggie would not be compensated. The girl only looked at him with big, frightened eyes. She was completely defenseless, and the official named Bonds understood it. "No. So you can only bring your personal belongings with you," he said. Maggie realized that she might not be allowed to take the mirror out of the house. After all, its frame, its wooden lace, was a work of art, and someone might want it. She ordered a new frame, the simplest, made of pine. When it arrived and the gardener brought it into the room, Maggie would not let him do any more work. "I'll do it myself." She stood in the doorway, not realizing that she was like a nurse, that no one was allowed to care for a contagious patient. If there were going to be consequences, it would be for her alone. Maggie walked over to the mirror, sighed deeply, and tugged a cloth off. She'd been at it all night, either consulting the internet or despairing at her own clumsiness. In doing so, she was careful not to even casually glance at the glass itself. The mirror seemed to her to be the judge, from whom it was impossible to hide anything, and she was afraid to see herself with a face contorted with confusion and fear. But it was impossible not to touch the mirror, impossible to move away from it, and Maggie began to feel something happening inside her. Sounds became especially distinct. She could hear a mouse scratching somewhere far away in the house. Ladies, and the colors became clear and bright. The dawn appeared in all its splendor as she stretched out her legs, which were already aching mercilessly. Maggie walked to the window and froze, thinking that she had never seen such beauty. The shimmering colors of the rising sun. The birds singing. Maggie covered her face with her hands. She thought she couldn't stand it all, that she was going crazy, but there was one last thing left. She carefully set aside the disassembled old frame, wrapped the mirror in rough paper, tied it with strings. She hid an unattractive black and white radio in a bag. As she approached the door, she already knew that the gardener was going up to the second floor, and that he was not pleased with the way she had hesitated. That's it, he wondered, looking at what she was about to leave the house with. A wheeled bag with stuff, a small purse with documents, a plastic bag with something, apparently light in weight, and a mirror, which no one could touch now. Just an old glass. That's it, Maggie confirmed. "Can you please call me a cab? Here's the address." She had never been in the apartment, the keys to which Anastasia had given her not long before the end. Truth be told, Maggie was in such shock that now she didn't care where she lived. "She'll stay here," she said to the gardener. "You will tell them that I have vacated the house. I am gone." She waved her hands, and again the gesture was helpless. Maggie could easily read the gardener's thoughts. "I could take something from here for myself. There's money to be made for antiques." "Take it," Maggie said, as a memento of Anastasia. "You were good to her, and your garden was so beautiful." She ran down the stairs, leaving the man standing with his mouth ajar, as the ride was across town. Maggie settled into the back seat and supported Mirror carefully, like a child. She didn't want the cabbie to help her carry her things in, though he offered. The worst thing was that the apartment was a one-room apartment. I mean, no meters didn't matter to Maggie, but to live with a mirror in one room. Then she saw a built-in closet in the hallway, and with a sigh of relief, she placed her burden there. Didn't even unfold the paper. Then she closed the closet and put a hook on top to make sure. Anastasia hadn't rented the apartment to tenants. No one had been in here in a long time, and the air was stale. It smelled like dust, if dust could have an odor. Or was it Maggie's sensitivity now, like a sheepdog? The girl opened the shutters and only now began to look around. It was the most ordinary apartment. and the current aesthetes would undoubtedly call it murdered. Wallpaper and floral in the room, furniture from the 20th century, a wall unit, and a few crystal vases, a sofa covered with a plaid plate. The kitchen made it especially clear that Anastasia lived here alone. A couple of small pots, a teacup forgotten on the table, a single stool beside a small table. Now her loneliness, like a baton. Anastasia has passed her loneliness to Maggie. The girl went to the window. That's what was fortunate about this house, the place where she stood, on the corner where the boulevard ended and the square began. A fountain with bronze figures of children, and behind it, a theater building, columns, arches, a real palace. I had to start living, everything from scratch. To go to the store and get at least bread, tea, and sugar, wash the dusty curtains, put things away. But Maggie hesitated, staring at the building that reminded her of a palace. She knew something was about to happen. The feeling was so clear that a chill ran down her spine. She needed to stop being a Robinson at heart, to end the involuntary reclusiveness she'd been living in all these years, to get to grips with all the things she still didn't know, to understand what stores she needed and how she should behave in them, what and where in this big city, how to use transportation. Maggie's situation was worse than that of a foreigner, the one who didn't know the language but understood some general principles, drew parallels. Maggie was perfect, a blank slate, and she didn't have a single familiar soul in this city, only scrappy, vague memories from her childhood of what and how things should be. For she had been very young then, she had just turned 6. Her first forays into the world had been closer to traveling to another planet than walking around town. She found a bakery on the first floor of her house, and that's where she went. Not knowing the value of money, she always bought very sparingly, but there were days when she made do with bread and milk. At moments when she was worried, her appetite was turned off completely, and now she was always shivering because of the abundance of new impressions that life had prepared for her. But almost every evening she found an opportunity to sit by the window. At 7 o'clock the play began in the theater, and on the eve of the performance, cars would arrive. Dressed up people would rush to the entrance and climb the steps. Maggie had never been to church, but something similar, reverent, she felt, emanated from this palace. And the expression Temple of Art was unfamiliar to her. And yet, unable to resist what was urging her to go there, she bought the ticket. It was imperative that she should go in with the others. She had not much in the way of outfits. In fact, these modest things could not be called outfits, except for a black silk dress which she rarely wore, and which looked newer than the others. The last time Maggie had worn it had been to Anastasia's funeral. As she arranged her hair into a simple style, she hesitated for a few moments. There was only one mirror in her apartment, a small one in the bathroom. The only thing she could see in it was her face, and even then in the dim light, and she needed to know what she was like. And Maggie knew who would tell her the truth. She went to the mirror, whose silent presence she had always felt, and lifted the tulle she had draped over it. A thin, almost ethereal girl stared at her inquisitively. She looked like an illustration in a book. The big eyes and the hands, the outline of the head, the neck, exactly like a graphic. Maggie sighed, both convulsed and relieved. She realized why the mirror saw her that way. Subconsciously, she feared that grief, confusion, helplessness had disfigured her soul. She'd already realized by now that it was the soul that the glass reflected. But no, she had not yet found herself in the world, absorbing what she saw, forgetting herself. And the mirror made her look like that, like a stroke of a pen had drawn her now, and still she was good. A quarter of an hour before the performance began, she walked through the doors of the theater, immediately joining the stream of spectators. Never before had there been so many people around. They crowded in the check room, strolled through the foyer. In fact, there was nothing special about this theater that would make it stand out from the others. Stairs to the second floor, and from there, the entrance to the balcony. At the foot of the stairs was a small winter garden and a pond with goldfish. A buffet in the corner. There is music, laughter, and colored lights. Because Maggie had just looked in the mirror, she saw very vividly now, in fragments, as if she were moving from one picture to another. Here was a hand with a crystal glass, a straw rising from the white foam. Here was a fish wagging its tail in the mysterious depths, and the tail was translucent, like a golden plum. The doors of the hall opened. Everything was full of expectation, premonition. Maggie entered timidly, as if she was not sure whether she had the right. The place where the miracle would be performed, she felt it. But it was impossible to fully immerse herself in this impression. She had to find her row, her place. Finally, she sank down into the red velvet chair and froze, hardly breathing. The performance made an overwhelming impression on her. It must have been a long time since anyone cried at an old operetta. Silva had been in this theater for years. But Maggie was mesmerized by the music. Tears came to her eyes, and she was sitting near the stage. And when Silva threw the edge of her bow on her shoulder, a scarlet feather fell into the girl's lap. Maggie clutched it in her fingers in a purely mechanical gesture. Almost from the very beginning, her gaze was fixed on the actor who played the protagonist. Maybe he matched Edwin in years. He was older, but in acting, everything is conditional. Maggie saw a tall, statuesque man with noble features. And how he gave his hand to the heroine. It was tenderness. To the fingertips, the tenderness that makes the heart stop. Maggie had a bad realization that the play was over and she had to go home. She could still hear the music still be there. And at home, she could think of nothing else but the magical fairy tale unfolding before her eyes. And never before had she had such dreams as she had that first night. From that day on, Maggie became a regular at the theater. There was a ballet and an opera, but she always went only to the operetta, where the poster bore the name of the artist whose image now appeared to her as soon as she closed her eyes. Week after week, month after month, Maggie lived like that. She tried to do things during the day, still bought herself some meager food, looked for a place that would hire her. But things didn't work out, and the people who refused Maggie were understandable. The girl gave the impression of being weird. It was as if she was looking at you, but she saw something of her own, and her lips smiled slightly. The unsure lady asked her bluntly and rudely, "Are you sick?" Maggie shuddered and looked as if she had woken. "No." "What did you say?" "That's the very thing. We have production here, workshop. Everyone has to be attentive, and you're dreaming in some clouds. No, you can't even go to the factory as an apprentice." Maggie realized that the money was running out. Meanwhile, the city was preparing for the new year, dressed in sparkling garlands, and the words "Happy New Year" could be heard more and more often. It was only a couple days before the holiday when the frost hit. What a frost! You couldn't run from store to store, your fingers were glazed, and it seemed like they were going to break off like icicles. And it was necessary that, taking her jacket in the check room after the performance, Maggie heard the two girls in front of her discussing whether it was worth waiting at the exit to ask for an autograph or whether it was too cold and better to go straight home. Eventually, they decided to wait, and Maggie realized she would join them. She didn't need an autograph, but to see the man she thought about day and night beside her, oh, that would be a precious gift. They came out of the theater, and the frost immediately burned their cheeks. Everything around them was as bright as it is when the thermometer drops below -30. The headlights of the cars, the lights of the advertisements, the lanterns, the Christmas tree in the square, the stars in the sky. The sharp rays of light crashed and poured in from everywhere. Maggie's eyes were watering, but she was afraid to blink, lest her eyelashes stick together from the frost. The girls wore fur coats and warm gloves, and she wore a jacket with fish fur and a knitted cap. And yet, bored and cold, they were ready to leave, and she mentally asked them to wait because alone, without them, would not dare to approach the artist. Her sacrifice was endless. She was ready to stand like that all night long. The second wave. The audience had long since dispersed, began to leave the theater, those who had taken part in the performance. Maggie was afraid of not recognizing them, of missing out. All her hope was in these girls. Maggie knew that they were waiting for the same person, and so the girls hurried towards someone, slipping. The granite slabs in front of the theater were icy. Taylor did not come out alone. He was accompanied by a short, stout man, wearing a gray coat and an Ushanka hat. Evans. Maggie heard the young voices. The girls surrounded the artist, slipping him programs, their heads close together. Taylor wrote something and complained that the ink in the pen froze in the cold. Maggie moved closer, forgetting everything as she listened to his voice. And then the girls, laughing and thankful, hurried to the bus stop. It was a stone's throw away, and the artist looked at Maggie. "Baby, what do you want?" "An autograph," from excitement. And the fact that she was freezing, Maggie couldn't even utter a word. Taylor's companion was also looking at the girl. He was about 45 years old. Plain, unimpressive face. The artist had gotten serious. "Baby, you got someplace to go?" Maggie could have pointed to her house across the square, not 2 steps, but 1.5 steps, but she was shivering like a puppy. She would have been shivering like that if it had been a hot summer. It was all about who was talking to her. The men looked at each other. "We'll go with us," said Evans, concerned and yet very gently. "At least you'll have a warm night's sleep. You'll be cold here by morning, child." Later, Maggie learned that there was nothing surprising in the artist's behavior. He came from a theatrical family, his father also played, and his name was known. And do not count how many families have survived the tour, semi-poor conditions, sometimes lived in poor hotels, and Mom Evans took care of young artists, as if, and really was their mother. She took care of dinner, took care of things. Long ago there was no mom in the world, but Taylor remained her favorite son. And in an instant, the seemingly forgotten was resurrected, and he acted the way she would have acted. It turned out that the companion was an old friend of his, a journalist, and both of them were glad to meet each other. It was warm in the car. Maggie settled into the back seat and listened to their conversation, not really getting into it and not really believing what was going on. Taylor lived in one of the old houses on the same boulevard that had become the local Arbit 30 years ago. In the 90s, the tenants of the apartments on the first floor had been forced to move out, some by kindness, some by threats, and now it was all small. And the boulevard was decorated before New Year's Eve as beautifully as any street in the city, and the lanterns created an illusion of the 19th century, and the imagination could easily conjure up horses, carriages, ladies in long dresses and furs. "Evans, do not start any variety. I have an ulcer," said the journalist. And our guest should be poured hot tea by all means." Maggie sat in the big room on the couch and put her hands between her knees, trying to keep warm at the same time, and to make sure no one saw her fingers shaking. Evans, what a hostess, took his time sacredly making tea and, "Sit down, don't help me," cutting cheese and sausage. If the journalist didn't want to eat, the girl was undoubtedly hungry and needed to be fed. She looked so exhausted. He filled her plate himself, poured tea into a large mug. The men talked for a while. Maybe they wanted to give Maggie a chance to come to her senses, or maybe they'd gotten carried away and forgotten about her. Maggie caught bits and pieces of phrases. They talked about new plays, about some famous guitarists who were passing through their town. Evans wanted to hear them, but he didn't have to. "And I sat in their hotel room all night," said the journalist. "Vincent got carried away and played one thing after another." "No, tell me why you came to me," Evans said suddenly to Maggie, and she, who all these months had not told anything about herself, really began to tell, rambling, confused, sometimes stopping for a long time, choosing words, then finding them, then not finding them. She didn't hide the fact that she'd grown up in the old house that was the stuff of legends. Blushing slightly, she said that Anastasia was a distant relative who had replaced everything for her. Her friends, her classmates. But now Anastasia was gone, and Maggie had no joy left but to live an illusion. Evening after evening to forget about everything while the performance is going on and you can drown in this music, live, breathe it. And Maggie does not need anything else. Well, and she has no work yet, although it was not worth mentioning it at all. It is only hers, Maggie's problems. When she stopped talking, Taylor looked at his friend, a movement of his eyebrows. "What's up, Thomas? You know what occurred to me." Even said, "My sister-in-law and I don't get along very well, but as they say, we observe politeness. We try to do each other favors. She has her own beauty salon, and there, as far as I know, there's a turnover. It's not about the salary. The lady's character is very bitchy. But for the first time, don't you want to try? I'll write her a note. It's impossible to reach her on the phone. There are conversations going on all day long. Try it, girl, and then we'll think of something else. And every time I hope that you will say that Ilan is yours, divorced." Said the journalist. "I always thought that Leanne, on the 10th husband, will not stop. She will go head over heels, climbing higher and higher. Leanne will be the end of the road for her. I don't know who will be able to find a common language with this bitch." Still, Maggie waited a few days, didn't go anywhere, didn't inquire about a job, gathered her courage. The New Year's holidays helped her too. Everything was closed everywhere you looked. And then the money ran out completely and irrevocably. She couldn't ask for alms, could she? She found out the address of the beauty parlor and went. Maggie always walked now, even if the ends were large. She told herself that this way she would get to know the city, which was still unfamiliar to her. and there was nothing else to do but sit at home. On the way, she convinced herself to hold firm. The worst that could happen is that she would be rejected, but life didn't end there either. Then she would look for something else. Besides, she had a note from an old artist. Donovan seemed such a deity to her that she could not imagine who could refuse him. But she found it amusing that he was Taylor, and she was Taylor by her new surname. It was like a roll call in space. Or maybe Anastasia, sensing something, had chosen that name for her. Maggie encouraged herself. But when she saw the modern two-story building, she was afraid again. It looked like an expensive and very large cube, the kind of thing a giant might play with. She glanced once more at the address she had written down on the paper, hoping that it was a different house. No, it was a beauty parlor. Maggie sighed, clenched her hands into fists, and started up the steps. The door opened in front of her, sending a wave of warm air through it. Maggie walked in and froze, not knowing where to go next. Who to turn to? At the reception desk sat a girl, very young, pretty, in a uniform green robe. She said hello and asked if Maggie had an appointment, and if so, who did she have an appointment with? I'm about the job. Maggie had to cough and repeat the phrase. A second girl came up to the receptionist, white, tall, statuesque, her hair in a ponytail. Judging by her robe, she worked here too. She was obviously going to say something, but when she heard Maggie's words, she just snorted. And the receptionist was still trying to remain polite. What did you want to be? Do you have some kind of education? Maybe you're a beautician, a hairdresser, manicurist, anything. Maggie felt a pleading note in her voice. No, I didn't go to just high school. Me, she wants to be a cleaning lady, explained the redhead with a ponytail to her coworker. No, I don't think we have any. The receptionist began. Girl, said the redhead contemptuously, you should start somewhere else. Like waving a rag at the train station. Here you have to fit in, like came to us and transformed. Clients shouldn't see people like that from the street, Don't you look after yourselves at all? Maggie was so hurt, so confused, that she didn't even think of running away and slamming the door. But slamming the sliding door wouldn't have worked anyway. But then another woman entered the lobby, and Maggie immediately felt both women pull up. It was impossible to ignore her, and Maggie couldn't take her eyes off her for a few seconds either. The woman was young, short in stature, but with a regal posture. Her black dress emphasized the whiteness of her skin, and her hair, also black, fell in waves over her shoulders. Her lips, painted with bright red lipstick, were striking. The woman looked like an actress from an old movie. Maybe she was just looking like Dita Von Teese. Island Bush, the redhead with the ponytail, began. Maggie realized that before her was the owner of the salon, the same Leia with a bitchy character. The girls obviously wanted the scene with Maggie did not attract the attention of the boss, but she was already looking at Maggie and raised her thin eyebrows, waiting for an explanation. Maggie didn't have to look for the note, all the while clutching it in her pocket. And this is probably for you. She held out a piece of paper. Island Bush unfolded the piece of paper, took one look at it. Her expression didn't change, and she seemed to make decisions quickly. Now you going to be a cleaner? She asked. You have no education, and we have no other vacancies. Maggie nodded hastily. You can go out tomorrow. At 8 o'clock, you'll come with your documents to Kate. She nodded at the receptionist. She'll show you what to do. Aileen Bush crossed the lobby with a swift step. There was business waiting for her somewhere out there in the parlor offices. The girls were silent. Maggie nodded awkwardly at them, but there was still silence in the hall when she went outside. It is wrong to think that the work of a cleaner is the easiest. Anyone can do it, and that it doesn't take much skill to wag a rag. In the first days, Maggie was afraid that she would be kicked out with a bang. There was so much to remember, so many little things not to miss. After all, she had seen all these jars with cleaning and disinfecting agents for the first time, and now every day she had to do like a general cleaning in offices, halls, toilets, and not a speck of dust, not a speck of dust. Perhaps she worked harder than she really needed to. She stayed when everyone had long since gone home, and before she left, she would go over the surfaces with a white handkerchief to see if it was clean. One time she was even pitted by an elderly security guard. You live far away, he told her. Where are you going to go across town now? You don't have money for a cab yet, I know. Lie down here on any sofa and sleep till morning. But Maggie looked at him with such frightened eyes that he just waved his hand and said, do as you please. And she was afraid of any arbitrariness, any violation of the rules, in case she was about to be pointed at the door. She saw her first job as the only one in the world. She had no idea where she would go if she was chased out of here. The salon soon stopped noticing her. She was so mute, wouldn't say a word. She never objects to anyone. She nods and does as she's told. "Girls, we have a cleaner, some kind of patient, Nora," W.I. said to her coworker's red-haired Laura. "Well, the one from the fairy tale about Morozko. She's actually Maggie," the hairdresser objected. "Well then, Maggie's patient. Before her, it seems. No one here with a mop and a rag could hold out for long. The salary is 3 pennies, but our Loca asks for a lot. Let's see how long this one lasts." However, Laura immediately forgot about the cleaning lady. In her opinion, she was not worth even a mop. Maggie kept her eyes on her. She especially liked to watch the makeup artist at work, though she only did it surreptitiously. Sometimes, as Maggie walked by, an unassuming middle-aged woman would sit in the chair. And then Maggie would meet her in the lobby when the client was getting dressed, and the girl couldn't help but notice how much better looking she was, as if she had partially regained her younger years. And there was a sparkle in her eyes, and one day Maggie couldn't take it anymore. When she was cleaning Camelia's makeup artist's office in the late afternoon, she sat down in the chair herself, touched her eyes with a brush, then her eyelids, touched her eyelashes with mascara and her lips with lipstick, and stared at her transformed face for a long time. The next day, no one noticed her imposture, and since then Maggie had occasionally allowed herself to steal. When there was no one else in the salon but her, she painted her new image. She had only glimpsed Camelina's work, but she tried to imitate it, and she couldn't believe herself. She was becoming completely different. Mature and very beautiful, she was now coming home so tired that the only strength left was to take a shower, drink tea, and sleep. The mirror hung like that, covered in a dull haze. Sometimes, if Maggie woke in the night, she thought she saw someone in white standing in the corner. She was startled for a moment, then remembered what was in front of her and closed her eyes again. Once, when she thought her makeup came out particularly well, she dared to lift the cloth and look at herself, and she shuddered violently. There, in the looking glass, she was exactly as she had been before, very young, without any makeup. Just a girl of 18, thin, with big frightened eyes. But the room behind her was not reflected, as if it were not there at all. It was just darkness. It frightened Maggie, and she hastily put the towel back and stepped back with a pounding heart. There was no reason, though, no reason at all. The salary, which the girls scornfully called 3 pennies, was enough for now. At work, Maggie immediately changed into her uniform and stayed in it all day. Work and home, she never went anywhere else, and she had nothing to spend her money on. She had not yet seen for herself the temptations of the big stores, and now there was no energy left for the theater. Surprisingly, after Evans had talked to her, she was no longer as eager to go to plays as she had been when she had breathed them. Maggie knew now that she had been given something more. She could call Taylor. He'd given her his phone number and talk to him, to himself, not stare silently out of the auditorium at his character, like not just her, but the entire audience. No, she hadn't dialed his number, but she had it, which meant that at any moment she could pick up her cell phone, and already that made her feel happy. She spoke to him mentally, and for now that was enough. That evening, she didn't realize that Aileen Bush had stayed in her office. Maggie was about to finish her work when she heard someone enter the lobby. The guard said hello and was answered by a male voice. Surprisingly, the visitor, who had come in at an odd time when none of the masters were present, was not asked to leave. The visitor walked down the hall toward the office where Maggie was finishing mopping the floor. The girl hurriedly bent over. The partition separating her from the corridor was made of glass, and Maggie saw a young man in a light-colored coat with pleasant and somehow familiar features. "Good evening," he began, and where they looked at each other. Maggie was a little confused, wondering if she would be guilty of something. The young man looked as if he were enchanted. Working this late. He didn't know what to say, and it was obvious he'd said the banal words just to avoid being impolite. "And you were looking for..." And immediately she realized who was in front of her. This is what Evans might have looked like when he was younger. "So it's Aileen Bush's husband," and Maggie said what she didn't doubt. "No, she's probably long gone. And if you see your father, please thank him for me." "But we agreed to meet here," said the young man, "and you are the girl my father told me about." So he hadn't forgotten about her yet. And Maggie's lips trembled. She was trying to hold back a smile. So they looked at each other and smiled. "Well, I guess if it was about a tramp freezing outside the theater, that's me." "About me," Heels tapped on the stairs. Island Bush was coming down. One glance at Maggie was enough for her to notice and appreciate her makeup and to understand its origin. "You'll put $3,000 in the cash register tomorrow." She had been addressing the girl as you for a long time. "If you touch the cosmetics again, you'll be fired." Maggie turned away hastily to hide her flaming face. She knew she wouldn't reach for the jars and boxes on Camelia's table again. Wouldn't even look at them. She'd gotten herself in trouble after all. "Melia." The young man began with a soft reproachfulness. Maggie remembered his name, Erlan. Elon Smith. But Eileen Bush did not wish to pay any more attention to this episode. She talked about her own business, about some accounts, and was the first to head for the door. Eileen Smith, with a guilty glance at Maggie, followed. When the girl was alone, the guard in the lobby was not to be counted. It seemed to her that her strength had run out all at once. She didn't think she had enough to finish cleaning. She sat hunched over on a bench in the hallway for a while, and then she scrubbed the floors. And then she literally walked home. It was snowing, beautiful big flakes. There was no wind, and the snow was falling so slowly that it looked like a curtain connecting heaven and earth. I wanted to sit down and not go anywhere else. And for some reason I wanted to cry. No matter how tired Maggie was that night, she could hardly sleep. She shuffled back and forth on the narrow, hard bed, desperate to get up and not even doze off yet. She got up, dripping valerian, the only medicine she had, and then anger replaced the sadness that brought tears to her eyes. So rather, a stray thought struck her, but it won't come true. It probably won't come true. Maggie ran to the bathroom, took a small mirror off the wall, breathed on it, and wiped it thoroughly. Then, holding it in her hands, she held it up to the larger mirror. After all, she herself, looking for a while into the magic glass, is charged with its power, then maybe, and the ordinary mirror will take over her, at least for a while. Maggie stood like that for a few minutes, and then looked in the small mirror. It worked. The same reflection was looking back at her as in the big mirror. Maggie knew that soon enough it would all be over, that the cheap glass would be left to itself, but she hoped what she had planned would succeed, and who would be able to expose her in that case? That evening, as she finished her work, Maggie didn't think about the makeup or Camellia. None of it interested her anymore. She left the landlady's office for last. She left, taking from Eileen Bush's desk a small mirror on a stand, an expensive Italian mirror that was always on the salon owner's desk. Maggie left the mirrors to talk to each other overnight, and in the morning, as she tucked her mistress's piece into her purse, she felt that it seemed heavier. Maggie arrived at the parlor before anyone else and managed to put the mirror back in its place unnoticed. She closed the office and hurried downstairs to her den, to the rags, the brushes, the vacuum cleaner. She recognized her boss's footsteps immediately. Only Eileen Bush wore such high heels to work. There were voices in the corridor, girls greeting the mistress. She answered them. There was Eileen coming up the stairs. For a while was silence, but Maggie was now as if she were all sharpened to hear. Her hearing was suddenly so sharp that she marveled at herself, and she heard it, that suppressed, horrified shriek. Maggie couldn't help herself, opening the door to the stairs. She knew she couldn't go into her boss's office. She knew she couldn't go into the supervisor's office unless she really shouted enough for everyone to hear, and then she could go in with the crowd. But it was impossible not to find out what had happened. Maggie had barely made it to the second floor when there were false footsteps. Maybe that's how zombies walk. Dumb pause. Dumb, 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 bon, pause, dumb. The office door opened, and Eileen Bush appeared on the threshold. Her eyes were halting. She was groping her face and looked absolutely stunned. No way, no how. She had discovered a fatal disease. And she ran like a girl to the end of the hall. Maggie realized where she was going. There was another mirror hanging in the bathroom. She couldn't know what her superior saw, but she could clearly picture it. The fixed round eyes of a bird of prey, the leathery skull, the disheveled hair, a wicked grotesque of what she thought was the most beautiful thing in the world. And after all, Eileen Bush, when the first acute impression has passed and she is convinced that she has not lost face, she will not even be able to arrange a reprimand to the girls. No one brought anything to her office. Just her favorite mirror, which stands in the same place, played a cruel joke. Maggie was cleaning as if nothing had happened when the female employees began to whisper that the boss felt unwell, called a cab, and went home. I couldn't even drive myself, can you believe it? God, maybe she'll take a sick leave at least once in 100 years. We'll at least rest without that vulture, was heard from all sides. You can't wish for bad things, it'll come back to you. Let's wish her a trip around the world for about 3 years, to steady her nerves and ours. The girls loved Aileen Bush. I'll tell you that. In the evening, when Maggie was finishing cleaning, Irlan arrived unexpectedly. She flinched when he opened the door. What did he want here? His visit seemed to be nothing but trouble. Now she knew for sure that he hadn't come for his wife. Aileen Bush hadn't been here since this morning. Yes, and Ireland, as soon as he saw her, Maggie took his hat off his head and went to her with the sweetest smile. I wanted to apologize for yesterday, he said. I know that Leia can behave very unpleasantly to others, but maybe it's the laws of business to be tough. Otherwise, you can't reach the heights. I realize it's no consolation to you, but let me at least compensate you for what you had to spend because of my wife. You haven't done anything wrong. I understand a young, beautiful girl. It's impossible to resist emphasizing her beauty. Len took some bills out of his wallet. Maggie recognized them. They were red $5,000 bills, and placed them on the dressing table. Maggie's eyebrows flew up. "Nee, this is for you. A little more for moral damages, as the lawyers say. Maybe you'd like to buy yourself some perfume or something, some trifle. I'd be very glad to know that you've forgiven this unpleasant episode and are not angry. I'm still not taking it. How's Evans?" The first phrase came out in a shorthand, the second eagerly. Every piece of news about Taylor, even in passing, was precious to Maggie. No, Father. Rowan apparently didn't know how to switch so quickly. I've seen him for quite some time. We mostly talk on the phone. He seems to be doing well. Playing. Maggie sincerely could not understand how, having all the opportunities to be near such a man, and she did not see Taylor's equal now, one could not value it. Exchange it for something else. For talking with Island for some TV or club, time was running out, and you could never make up for what you had wasted so ineffectively. At the same time, she felt that Irlan was talking to her in a special way, with unusual interest. The girls at the salon would have said hitting it off, but knew how indifferent she was to all this. It happens. Both are young, good-looking, and one of the parties makes every effort to sow some kind of spark, but in vain. There's no fire, not even a small one, not even the light of a candle. "Take it, please," Maggie said, gently placing the bills in Irish's hand and squeezing his fingers. "And don't torture yourself. I'm not angry. I really am." Taylor got married very early, while still a student in the vocal arts department. He was considered one of the best there, but he knew he was unlikely to see the capital stage, unless a miracle happened and he was invited. From other future singers, Evans differed unprecedented for actors' modesty. He realized that his voice was good but not unique, and he was categorically incapable of chewing his way out of a seat. Therefore, he had no doubt that if anyone would make it to the big stage, it would be less talented, but certainly more self-confident guys. All right, let it be a provincial theater, as long as he was given the ones he dreamed of. In his senior year, he was already involved in performances at the local opera and ballet theater. And there he saw her, Lara, a future ballerina who had the most beautiful legs in the world. He was coming up the stairs, and she was coming down to meet him, to go to her wing, which was the classrooms where the students of the choreographic school were engaged. He saw her singing feet, as he called them afterward, and could not take his eyes off them. He began to look for an opportunity to meet her, but she seemed to be avoiding him. She didn't answer the notes he passed with the other guys, the ones who were braver. And when he got her number and tried to call her, she wouldn't answer his calls. Her conversations can please. No, I hate being looked at like a circus horse. I saw where you were looking and what you were looking at. But that's the first impression, he excused himself. I saw the face and the soul. Only a little later it was when they were both involved in the same play, and he put all the flowers he got. And he was playing the main character and the bouquets didn't fit in his hands. At her feet, when they married, his teacher jokingly rebuked him for putting a cross on his future. If you're married, you'll lose half the interest, if not most of it. Why don't you want to keep the audience intrigued for longer? Look at the characters you play. Can you remember a single play that starts with a happy wedding? That's the finale, and that's where you've chosen to start. But Taylor didn't care what anyone thought of it. He knew that he had met the only woman in his life, that he was a one-woman man, and that it was fate. But it turned out that Laura didn't think so at all. As it turned out later, Laura was attracted by the prospect a young, handsome, talented artist from a famous family. Lara was still very young and thought that fame and a well-to-do life would come with the package. But then everything went wrong. Ireland was born, and immediately he and his father were to blame for everything. Lara suffered at once. Figure, career, and ego. Her to return to the former form could not manage. In the theater she was not expected at all. Unlike her husband, she was still only a corps de ballet, where no one would notice her absence. And to sit in the apartment, so simple, ordinary, to do the usual household chores, Lara shuddered. She was always acutely aware of how short a woman's life was. And a missed day was like a missed year to her. A year of tantrums, hand-wringing one nanny, another, and the old freedom doesn't come back and no roles are given. And how sickening it is to stand over pots and take up the mop. Eventually, Lara ran away. Island was not yet 5 years old when she left her son with the nanny, a note to her husband, and disappeared so suddenly that if it hadn't been for the note, a manhunt would have been launched. Lara found herself much later. In the capital, somewhere there, she settled in theater circles, quite possibly not as a dancer, but as some kind of administrator. The main thing, in the art and in the right circles, that she is going to remarry. Evans learned when his wife asked for a divorce. But who became her next companion, and what ended her struggle with everyday life? This was not even rumored. Taylor, on the other hand, continued to consider himself a one-woman man. He saw nothing good in it. Rather, he thought of it bitterly, as ugly. Take, for example, those dogs who pine for years and wait for their master's return. If the whole canine species were like that, it would be extinct. We need to shake things up and get back on track, but Taylor couldn't. He found a nice older woman who cared for Igor, like a grandmother, and she settled into his home for many years, gradually becoming a member of the family from a nanny, a theater, and a son. That's all Taylor's life was made of after Lara left. But the longer time went on, the more friends he made. His sincerity and charm, the complete absence of star disease, care for others, and the aura of great talent, which could not help but feel. All this made it so that people were drawn to him, and a certain circle was formed. Undoubtedly, Evans hoped that his son would be his main friend when Ireland grew up, but the young man almost repeated his own fate. He married very early in a frank bitch, except that neither theater nor talent Ireland had, and God knows what kept his soul. Taylor could not find out. Leia was doing her best to limit communication between father and son, fearing bad influence, that Erlan would ask for freedom, but there were others. The same Thomas Adams, who also lost a son, only hopelessly the boy died. Thomas also reached out to Taylor for comfort. People of different professions and different characters in the house of the artist found that place where material things remained behind the threshold, and only what was valued in childhood and youth. Kindness, nobility, dreams, matters. Amsran said that Taylor has his own mafia. Remember the Godfather, Evans? Don Corleone solved all his cases through friends, acquaintances, relatives. Only most people owed him something and paid the debt. You too. No matter what you have, whether you get sick, whether you need help, you'll find everything you need from your friends. But your mafia is not based on fear and duty, but on love. Maggie was one of the first to notice him when he came in again, but she hoped sincerely that he was not here to see her. She was in her office, and the salon was full of customers, but she was not going to be complimented by Iwan Smith in this atmosphere, or to be handed that unfortunate money again. Nevertheless, it was to her that Ireland headed. "Please," Maggie said, "I told you. You don't have to give me anything back. It's really my fault. So it's a normal fine." "I'm not here for that at all." Ireland looked very tired and gaunt. "Father is ill. Can't you be his nurse for a few weeks?" he asked. "If you can." Of course, Maggie's voice was clear. She was ready to go right now without even putting on her jacket. "I don't care if she loses her job. What about him?" An intermittent sigh. There was no play in Irish's gaze now, only anxiety. And Maggie was looking at him just as anxiously. "Doctors are diagnosing pneumonia. For now. You know what could happen with that diagnosis. Anyway, there's no way to know yet. There's a doctor there every day. A nurse comes in to give shots. But you need someone to be with you at all times." "Are you on the machine?" Maggie asked. "God, what a fee. What are you talking about?" "Don't hurt me." The next 2 weeks were probably the hardest in her life. The disease was ready to win, to take the artist with it, as it had already taken many and many. The doctor was from the same mafia. From close friends, came twice a day. The nurse came even more often. Her name was Isabella, and as Maggie realized, she had been in love with Taylor before. Isabella knew her work perfectly. She had a light hand for injections, but as often she had tears in her eyes, which is not typical of nurses. Maggie, Siri, in addition to night duty for the sick man, took care of the household. One day, when Evans had fallen asleep, she and Isabella, both drunk with fatigue, were drinking tea in the kitchen. "You know, he's so simple, so kind, so available," Isabella said. And Maggie knew she was talking about Taylor, but he doesn't really want to love anyone else. And he's built this ice wall between himself and the people around him that's thin, transparent, you can't see it. But it's there. I tried, figuratively speaking, to press my whole body against it and melt it, but I couldn't. I just froze myself over and over again. And it hurt so much to thaw. Maggie was given strict orders from the doctor to take her temperature and saturation every hour, and if anything, to contact him at any time of the day or night. And then call an ambulance. Evans didn't complain, only said once with a guilty smile, "I keep looking for a pose that will make it easier to breathe. My lungs feel like they're flooded with water." And then he had, "Children, don't worry. I've lived long enough. Don't worry about me." That day it seemed to her that an even more difficult time was coming and that the end might be near. So Maggie decided to go home and get some things so that she could stay here permanently. A few changes of underwear, the little things you can't do without if you're not in your own house. Maggie had everything she was going to take with her in a quarter of an hour. And then, she didn't know why, the movement was purely mechanical, automatic. She plugged the plug of the old radio into the socket. Every time she thought it would never come to life again, never make a noise. But it always woke up. There was a whistling sound, and then rustles, noises. Maggie spun the wheel slowly. "Take the mirror to him," Anastasia said suddenly, as if she were in the next room. Maggie flinched, so that the receiver almost fell out of her hands. "Am I going crazy?" She asked either herself or the radio, and almost immediately asked the question she thought she would never ask. "Anastasia, what about my mom?" Maggie hadn't thought of her mother in recent years, but now, as the emptiness approached, and no one would be by her side. "She's not here," Anastasia said. "Forgive me both, you and her." The noise came again, and it was so easy to imagine that it was all Maggie's imagination that she was beginning to have some sort of auditory hallucination from fatigue. And then she walked over and, biting her lip, began to remove the mirror from the wall. The Taylor's apartment was crowded until the evening, and this despite the fact that the doctor had forbidden all but the most important people to come, but there were quite a few of them. Besides his son, whose place was in any case here, there was Isabella, and also that partner who had sung with Evans for many years, and Thomas, who could not be excluded. But few people went into the room of the sick man himself. They crowded into the other rooms and into the kitchen, making tea and coffee, talking quietly. Everyone is surely waiting to say goodbye. Maggie's heart broke. But the sick man was dozing all the time. He didn't call out to anyone. Finally, near midnight, Maggie was the only one left in the house besides Evans. Usually this time was the most precious to the girl, but it was also the most difficult. She alone was responsible for anything that happened to Taylor during these hours. The sick man was half sitting up, covered with pillows, breathing hard, but each time he asked Maggie not to sit beside him, but to go to bed. "Put my tea on the table and go," he pleaded. "I promise. If anything, I'll call." He's not strong enough to call, Maggie used to think, but he's delicate enough. He'll try to go to the afterlife quietly, so as not to disturb anyone. And she distracted Taylor as much as she could, asked him about plays, about roles, about familiar artists. But often, when he enthusiastically began to tell, she noticed that he was choking, and then began to talk about anything herself, as long as he didn't chase her away. But presently she brought him tea, and immediately went out and returned, carrying back the heavy thing. "No, what is it?" Evans asked quietly. The disease wouldn't let him speak any louder. "Mirror, look at yourself. You want to show me how sick and ugly I've gotten." Taylor stroked her arm with dry, hot fingers. "Maggie, I already know. Don't, really. You were welcome." Never had such a pleading tone been in her voice. And he looked. There was silence. Maggie looked not at the mirror, but at Evans. At first his face became more and more stern even. It was the way one might look at an approaching storm, at an enemy on the offensive, and at the last line beyond which was eternity. Then his expression changed now. Evans looked as if he was eagerly waiting for the judge to pronounce a verdict or acquittal. And finally, tears came to his eyes. Then Maggie stepped back and looked too. He was very young there. That Taylor remained a child at heart, she knew. But now it was confirmed. Maybe only a little older than she was, about 25 years old, but no more. Not a king, but a prince. And yet, it was undeniably him, impossible not to recognize. And his gaze was both trusting and wise and something else. It was as if he knew everything, as if he'd been where Anastasia was now. Evans sighed convulsively, but as deeply as if the air had finally broken through his chest. "I'm out of breath," he said, not believing himself, "but I can't be like this. If I am like this, then all of life is justified. It means that in what I've experienced, I've kept my soul." Maggie cried, covering her face with her hands. She felt as if she were the one who had been pardoned. "No, Thomas," Evans said. "I'm done with the stage. After what I've been through, I'm tired and out of breath. But that's not the point. I still want to live, you know, all my life in art, in the realm of shadows, in imaginary images. And life slipped through my fingers. Now, as long as I am destined there, I want to go out on the grass in the morning to walk barefoot on it. I want to plant a garden, damn it. I want to go to the sea, not during the time free from touring, but when I want to see it." "That's quite a gift you've given yourself," Adam said. They walked slowly, turning from one garden path to another. Evans had sold his luxurious bar apartment, withdrawn his savings from the bank, and bought the old house. "It's not a gift for me," Taylor said seriously, "or rather, it's not just for me. It's primarily for her." Maggie was in the house, fiddling with dinner. "And of course, nothing will change for you," Evans went on. "All my friends can come to see me whenever they like, as long as they like. We'll have a table here in the garden, under the awning. Oh, what evenings we'll have. I think the house has learned a lot, too, in the time it's been in other people's hands. It won't be so unsociable now." "You look a lot younger than you used to," Adams looked at his friend, and an involuntary smile touched his lips. "We were scared for you back then. But it turns out your illness has done you good." Taylor patted him on the shoulder. They were silent for a moment. "Now I'm waiting." Evans couldn't procrastinate any longer. "Did you find her?" "Yes," the journalist took a piece of paper out of his pocket and handed it to him. "Maggie's mother's alive. She moved to a neighboring town, probably didn't want to see a place where everything reminded her of. She never married again, no children, work and home, lives pretty much reclusive. Here's her address and phone number, of course. I didn't tell her myself. That's between you and Maggie." "I should probably be the first one to call," Evans said worriedly. "It would be too much of a shock if she heard her daughter's voice right away. And Maggie should be careful because she doesn't know yet either. Of course you don't die of joy, but if she could die, it was when we were all afraid for you. Do you remember what she was like then? She was black all over. Now I regret turning down the hospital, and she saw the whole thing. I should have gone in there behind closed doors, but then she wouldn't have saved you," Adam said simply. "So this whole chain, the whole thing, since that terrible flood, not one link in it was random, as nothing is random or meaningless." Maggie's voice came from inside the house. Now that she could breathe easier, she made coffee and hummed something simple, because she knew the old house wanted to hear living voices.